So we will go forward with Ryan. So do we want to do public comment first? Okay, you want to do, okay, great. So I'll open up public comment. Please join us. I will ask that you state your name for the record. Nice to see you. And please let us know. This is on the change order or change for addition of the Lindsay Creek Bridge cut as part of the historic Columbia River Highway State project. So please go right ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Wayne Stewart. I'm the chair of the Historic Columbia River Highway Advisory Committee. And with me today is Ernie Derpella, who is the governor's Multnomah County representative on the advisory committee as well. We'd like to thank the OTC for all of the past support that you've given us as we've been working on reconnecting the old highway. As you know, the 73 miles of the original scenic highway was severely disrupted by the construction of Interstate 84, and about 22 miles of that original length was actually cut off, and we end up with a series of remnant pieces of the old highway kind of left in the gorge and a lot of missing pieces. At any rate, in 1987, the Oregon legislature directed ODOT and Oregon State Parks to reconnect the missing pieces with the state trail. And so far, 18 miles of the missing 22 miles have been reconnected. We're down to the last 4 miles to completely have a reconnection. And of course, as often happens, the last 4 miles are the hardest and most expensive and most rock work and tunnels and that sort of thing. Last fall, we completed about 1.25 miles of state trail from Starvation Creek going west. And about a month ago, contractor started work on a section of the trail starting at Wyeth going east. So we've got recently 1.25 miles coming this way, 3 miles under construction coming this way, and we have this gap in the middle of about a half of a mile. And we've been calling that the bench cut, and that's what we're here for today. Once that we have that gap filled, we will have about 5.5 miles of completed recreation trail starting at the Forest Service Wyeth campground and extending all the way to the Viento State Park campground. So 5.5 miles of good trail with campgrounds anchoring either or both ends of it. I have given you a copy of our 2017 progress report. And on it, I've flagged the location of that gap that we've been calling the bench cut. So I'd like to thank you very much for your past support and ask that you continue your support as we work very diligently trying to complete the last 4 miles of the trail. So that's what I had. Any questions or comments?
Do we have questions? I would say thank you very much for your leadership and for the commitment to this project, and it's nice to see you. So
good to see everyone here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for helping me orchestrate.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Boehne, members of the Commission. For the record, I'm Ryan Winsheimer, the ODOT Region 1 Manager, and I'm here this morning with 2 important folks to provide some additional context for Agenda Item G and to provide you with a recommendation for moving this important project forward. First, I'd like to introduce Peter Field, the Planning and Programs Branch Chief from Western Federal Lands Division of the Federal Highway Administration. For the past 30 years, ODOT's been partnering with Western Federal Lands to fund and deliver projects that provide access to our federal lands through the state, including delivery of the last segment of the historic Columbia River Highway State Trail in partnership with ODOT. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pete for a minute.
Hi, Chair Boehne, members of the Commission. I'm Pete Field. And yes, we have a great partnership with ODOT over the years, and we enjoy that. So
Great.
on many levels.
Is your blue light on for your
My
mic?
blue light is on.
Okay, let's move.
Just a little closer. Thank you. Thank you for the assistance. Okay, so we're like a delivery arm for the Federal Highway Administration. You have a group here in Salem that works with ODOT. We're the group that then works with federal land management agencies, states, and counties to deliver projects. We have Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and the parks in Wyoming. And so, and we also have the Defense Access Roads in Montana. There's another little project we get to do, which is kind of cool. So, but we're here today because we do projects with state DOTs, but especially with the Forest Service, and this is the State Trail one, and obviously an important project. So obviously the Historic Columbia River Highway is kind of the road that we work on. Like, we just finished about $150 million rehab of going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park. And the cool thing is that Historic Columbia River Highway rivals any of those roads truly in the country. And traveling I-84 out Monday out to the Dalles, I was thinking even I-84 at times is amazing through that area. So that's the kind of roads that we do, and we enjoy the partnership there. So in the past, we had the Forest Highway Program. I don't know if people remember that was 100% funded for access to the forest, but with MAP 21, that changed to the Federal Lands Access Program, the acronym's FLAP, and that includes a match. So part of the request today is match funds for the Federal Lands Access Program funds that have been added to the project to hopefully achieve the gap that was articulated that we'd like to get done. And yeah, there's a series of great projects. We worked at Eagle Creek to Cascade Locks, just a series of great projects. And the project just completed was really nice, the last 1.25 miles there. So it'd be nice to complete this gap and make it work. And so anyway, and what was nice is ODOT Region 1 has been funding the project that's before you today, the Lindsay Creek section, and hopefully, right, in a perfect climate, we would have got the right bids and we would have been able to fund it out of the money available. But we appreciate ODOT's support there to that project. So I think we're ready.
Okay. Well, as most of you got to experience the Historic Columbia River Highway State Trail on our OTC tour this past summer, breathtaking views, natural landscapes, many wonders of engineering it took to build the original highway. Unfortunately, given the challenges of that same landscape, very constrained working environment between a mountain, a highway, a railroad, and the mighty Columbia River, and now having received multiple bids that all came in higher than our engineer's estimate, we have a clear understanding of what it's going to cost to deliver this particular segment. Today, we're bringing forward a choice to apply additional funds now and proceed with the full project, or we could choose to not complete the Lindsay Creek bench cut now and perhaps come back at a later date and rebid this project section as a standalone project when funding is secured at some point in the future. So I've asked Pete to just share some of the background about how we got to this point on this particular project.
Yeah, so how do we get to today where we're asking for more money instead of handling it within what we had available? And so we got here because we knew that the money in the STIP might not have been enough to do the entire project based on the engineer's estimate. So what we did is we put it in two parts. So we developed a base bid that we felt secure would be able to come in under the amount of available money, and then option X. Don't ask me how it's not option A, but it's just option X. And that's the gap that was articulated as the bench cut. And so in preparing for it, we wanted to make sure that we could at least move something forward. And as Ryan articulated, we got bids higher than we expected. Now, one interesting thing about the bids, that just some background, when we get bids, you look at, there was several bidders. It was 6 or 7, which that's a good sign, right? And the other interesting thing was 3 of them were very close. So that's another sign that the bid that we're talking about today, the amount that we'd like to fund, is probably the cost to do the project at the market rate. Sometimes you get a bid that's extremely low or something, you kind of get concerned someone didn't quite bid right. I don't think we have that concern here. I think we have an accurate amount to perform the work. And so in order to complete that, right, that is the request, is getting that additional amount of money to close that gap to be able to fund option X. And just a quick aside, I might be jumping off the script here. So myself, Bob Bryant, Region 4, Emily Ackland, Association of Oregon Counties, we sit on the Oregon Program Decision Committee for the Federal Lands Access Program. So the Federal Lands Access Program has added $3 million to this project also. So we added $1.6 million to the Wyeth Creek and the Summit Creek. Those were already FLAP projects inside of the larger project. So we added $1.6 million to those, and then we moved from a future project, Mitchell Point, we moved back $1.4 million to, quote, your project, in order to contribute to funding the gap. And just as an aside, that's what happens typically, right? Whether you're in Yellowstone or Historic Columbia River Highway, sometimes you have to make these programming decisions, and committing to a corridor, right, is the key, that we're still moving that money forward to complete these sections. So I think we're set, Ryan.
Okay. I guess wanted to express in that piece is just that as soon as the bids came in and we recognized that what the total project cost would be, we tried to jump into action and try to figure out how we could come up with this additional $6 million. As Pete described, we've got the $3 million that's coming from the FLAP committee, and then the remaining $3 million we're requesting through the Transportation Enhancement Discretionary Program. And I've asked Mac Lynn, who's our Active Transportation Section Manager, to be with us this morning to provide you a little bit more information about that program and the recommendation to approve the specific allocation.
I have a point of clarification before we dive into that piece. So the timing, when were we bidding and when did we find out the bids are going to come in a bit higher, and just in terms of walking us back from today?
So the bids were open about a month ago. I could go get the date, right? Okay. And sure, you were there for that. But anyway, so the bid about a month ago. And then the unfortunate thing, or the opportunity here, is that the option X only has a finite life to June 1. So this is a good question, Chair Boehne, because we can't just keep a contractor out and have them hold their price forever. And so the life of that option goes to June 1. So that's an important date to consider in your actions. Is we'd like to proceed by June 1 in order to execute it. Otherwise, we're rebidding.
Okay. So the other piece that, let me ask, and this is probably a naive question, has there been an extension ever given for a 2-week period?
Knowing our contract development engineer, probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say is the nicest way to put it.
Okay.
She would probably hold firm to the fact that we could not extend it.
Okay. And I
is
know
it
you
in-
can't, those are tea leaves that I'm asking you to read.
Okay.
So I'll take it as such. But I'm just not, I want our commission to be aware of what it is that we're working with, and to be fully informed.
Just full disclosure, since we're having a conversation here. I
Yes.
mean, if there was if the commission was able to say to Western Federal Lands that it's highly likely, we might be able to do something, Bob and Emily and I, on the access program side, if we knew the payback was coming. If you needed more time, there might be a way to make that work. But I think we would need that commitment to not just, much like your decision today, to just not unilaterally put money onto a project. If we had that, we could probably make something work in that 2-week time frame.
The reason why I bring it up is, aside from, obviously, we've been committed to completing this project.
Yes.
The challenge is, I'm asking my commission to change a policy without really looking at the policy itself. We're actually asking for an exception, but I would imagine that my commission would want to know more about the program, be able to take that less about just one project and more about the holistic approach of why we would do something or not. So it isn't, I don't want to have it viewed as though it's not supporting a project. It's that we have a responsibility to look at the fund as itself and then determine whether or not that makes sense. So anyway, I very much appreciate the potential that you've brought about. Thank you.
Yeah, commissioners, thanks. So as part of one of my job requirements is we have several funding programs. Chair Boehne and I get to have a fun conversation around CMAQ as another area. This is another program that we manage, which is the Transportation Enhancement Program. It's a little bit of an older program, and this that we're talking about today is the Transportation Enhancement Discretionary Account. So this was committed to by the Commission back in 2003, and it's been longstanding since then. It's a first come, first serve funding source, if you will, that we have an application process and we use a committee to determine if that project's eligible or not. We've been operating that way for quite some time. And the real benefit of that is it was a funding source in between competitive selection processes. So before we started Enhance, we had a standalone TE selection process. So in the past, we'd had balances in this discretionary account where folks hadn't been coming to ask for it, get built up, and we would roll that money into the next selection process every 2 to 4 years of that TE program. Well, over time, as we created Enhance, and now non-highway Enhance, we've lost that standalone selection process. We've also seen less requests coming into that discretionary account, and we've lost the ability to kind of reallocate or redirect those funds. So we've got a little bit of a surplus built up. When this request came in, certainly a tremendous amount of support for this project historically. The TE committee funded 2 past projects and participated in a 3rd one through our Bike Ped Advisory Committee, through our Bike Ped grants. So there's a tremendous amount of support in the history of this corridor, as Pete said. The guidelines for the TE discretionary account set a maximum award of $1 million per project. Back in 2003, that was based on the size of project requests that were coming in, as well as that was about half of the annual allowance of TE funds, or TE discretionary funds. So that was why that limit was put in place. As I've mentioned, over time, we've been building up a surplus of funds. We've changed the way we select projects in this area, bike ped projects in particular, and thinking about an iconic project such as this one, putting on the table for your consideration, suspending that $1 million limit for this project. I'll pause there because I think we're primed and ready to have a conversation around what this TE discretionary program looks like. And I've been talking with my staff about doing that after we know what the funding package looks like. Because I think there's a critical opportunity to determine what are the gaps in our funding programs, especially in the area of bike ped or downtown improvements such as TE has done in the past, and identify what does that policy need to look like moving forward, as well as the appetite for funding off cycle, which is what this discretionary account program was built for. So all that being said, in your packet, you've got a list of the activities that this program has been used to fund. Bike ped obviously is there, off-road, or excuse me, off-system trails is a major component of that. And I'll highlight historic or preservation of historic transportation facilities. We've done some really unique things with our TE funds in the past, and this is certainly one area that I know we would have supported 10 years ago, which we did and have been doing since then. We've also had, I believe a letter was handed to you from our Bike Ped Advisory Committee expressing their support for this project as well. So a tremendous amount of support for it. And I realize the question is, should we suspend that $1 million limit, and why would we do that today? And I think leading up to the iconic project that this is and the commitment to the corridor, and recognizing we want to bring that policy conversation back to this group after the funding package to understand what are the needs long term in this program area.
And just one question, Matt. It was normally it's about $2 million a biennium, $1 million a year, and today the current balance of the TE program.
Yeah, so right now we're running at a balance through 2018 of just over $7.5 million. So this would draw us down to just about 4.5. And then we have additionally set aside 4.2 million in the draft 1921 STIP. So we have some significant money to talk about what that program should look like, and that's why I think it's important to come back to this commission with a proposal.
Okay.
Chairman, just to wrap up, we've included support letters from the Historic Highway Advisory Committee, from the Friends of the Historic Columbia River Highway, the Oregon Bike Ped Advisory Committee, encouraging approval of this joint recommendation for agenda item G. Completing the state trail has been a priority for this commission. The project is 100% designed, permitted, ready to go. Literally, the shovels are already in the ground right nearby. And the last point I would just want to make, which was when bids came in higher than we'd anticipated, ODOT and Wafflehead had a choice to simply, move forward with the base project and let the Lindsay Creek bench cut sit for another day, or choose to roll up our sleeves, which we did, and really identified, went back to the FLAP committee, did some hard work there in order to get their $3 million commitment, and we felt like we just needed to at least put this option together and put it on the table for your consideration. So with that, we'll open it up for any additional questions.
I would also note, while not large in terms of the overall project cost, but important in terms of a organization coming forward, there is the pledge of from the Friends of the Historic Columbia River Highway of $20,000, which I think for a small, I think that's commendable, and I just want to make sure that that was on the record.
And just in addition to that, Travel Oregon's also agreed to contribute $100,000 as part of this match.
Very good.
So yes, those organizations have really stepped up to try to do
Yeah,
that.
I want to make sure that they have the recognition. I think those commitments are important. Okay, so please, Commissioner.
Thank you. And so, Ryan, this project is eligible under the enhancement criteria, is that correct?
That's correct. And in fact, we went through the application process. So we talked about, we only had a month. We had to grab the application, fill it out, get it into the committee, or get it into MAC for advice. So we went through, we filled out all that paperwork and did get determined as eligible project.
So historic, bike ped, scenic, all these, they all fit into the enhancement category. So is the question we're being asked today is to make an exception on the ceiling of the dollar amount for this project, that we would exceed it to move forward on this project now?
Yes, so the question is two questions, really. One is the commission going to approve a $3 million request for this particular project, and then a programming commitment? So yes. So there's the two things, which is adding it into the program and also the suspension of the $3 million policy.
Okay.
Could be an exception to the policy. It doesn't need the suspension of the policy, which I think is also an important distinction.
Yes,
As
And
options.
that's your discretion. Yeah.
And what precedent does it set going down the road? Do you feel any particular vulnerability at how this is going to come back, and is it going to bite us in the rear at some point, or is this kind of a one shot and we're good with it deal?
Well, Mac might be better at addressing that particular question, since we're going to be potentially revisiting this policy very quickly.
Yes, so Commissioner O'Halloran, the way I would think about that is there's not too many big projects of this scale in our state, especially around these qualities that we look for in the Transportation Enhancement Program. My sense is we don't really have that sitting out there. And in our program's history, I don't believe the requests have come in for things of that scale. So I think this one is, in my opinion, truly unique in terms of the size and complexity. But I think that's why I think about why we'd want to revisit this program after the funding package to determine what is the need for these types of investments. But I feel like this one is such a unique corridor that I wouldn't anticipate we'd see something like this in the future.
Yeah, and I think a scenic and recreational value. We're not looking at it with a transportation getting from point A to point B being the critical need here. So anyway, thank you. That helps me understand it. Appreciate it.
Okay. Please.
So help me walk through this again, just because my brain's not working or something. So you opened bids a month ago. And so when you opened bids, you obviously thought maybe bids would be lower, or you wouldn't have put an option in there in the first place.
Correct.
So bids come in, they're quite a bit higher. You want us to continue with the option. Typically when bids come in, isn't it that the bid itself is 30 days? And the option may not be 30 days? Have you discussed any of that with the potential construction contractor?
I guess maybe to clarify your question, Commissioner, is your question the life of the bid and the option? Sorry, are you asking the question
The
about?
construction bid has a
Correct.
date. And you're saying that, if I understand this, the date is June 1st.
Oh, good question. Okay. Think of it as A and B, even though it's base and X. So A, the base bid, has been awarded. We've issued a notice to proceed. We've verified the bids. We've had the pre-construction, had a risk assessment. By the way, they put a double-wide trailer in the gorge, and some people are upset for their office. We'll work on that. But that project's a go, right? It is shovels in the ground, ready to go. Think of X then as a separate action.
Okay, so you've had X on the table for quite a while.
Yes.
And I am not opposed to the project at all. I think it's a great project. I am very opposed to amending a policy that we have. So just for the record, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to discuss the qualifications under the T&E program for this discretionary program and make sure I understand how this fits. I know your response, Ryan, was that it does fit. I just want to make sure I am agreeing with that. These funds are primarily for startup or gap funding. I think it qualifies under that criteria. These funds are not meant for projects that could have been competed for in the previous selection cycle, and I think that fits in this case because we really didn't have a competition in the last cycle because of the change in the program. It's for projects that directly support tourism or economic development. At least they should receive preferential consideration, and I think that clearly fits in this case. The project has to meet the same eligibility and technical requirements as DE projects awarded through competitive selection, and I think you're saying it does that. Strong local support has to be shown. There's no question about that. And it's subject to match requirements, and we're clearly demonstrating that. And it has to pass ODOT technical review with a rating of adequate or better. You didn't discuss that, but I assume that's occurred. And finally, a project qualifies as urgent and should not have to wait for the next competitive selection cycle. Of course, there isn't a next competitive selection cycle, but can you address the urgency question? You've sort of done that already, but if you could dig a little deeper. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think the sense of urgency, Commissioner, is that we have an opportunity to complete the construction now. So two choices, right? Either fund it now or put it out about 3 years from now to a separate package or combine it with a future phase. So the value of now, I guess this would be the sense of urgency, is we save about $300,000 in rock. So the section, the option X, the gap, the rock in there would cut $300,000 off the parent project, right? Because we get to save it. So otherwise that rock would just be wasted.
All right.
The other thing is that in theory, and this is predictive, right, is that which way are bids going to go in the next 2 to 3 years? And my opinion, right, is that they're going to go up because we seem to be in a better economy than we were, say, in 2008 when bids went down.
Right.
And we seem to be in steady fuel prices too, which, I don't know if they're going to go up or down, but at least I think it's just the sign of the economy. And the other urgency, to me, this is somewhat personal opinion now, but is that we fund the gap. And so you connect to a section of trail that's already been done. And so I think it provides to the public a better appearance of, fully completed project, that you can bike the full 5+ miles to the section completed last year. And so rather than just orphan that section out for 2 to 3 years, I think completing it then gives a sense of urgency. I would call it a sense of completionness, maybe funding the gap as the criteria said.
Right.
And so those to me are the reasons to go now.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I agree that there aren't any other big projects around. I can think of one in Southern Oregon, the continuation of the Bear Creek Trail from Central Point out to Grants Pass would be a great big similar project in many ways. Maybe not quite as spectacular as this, but could be a very good big project. But I'm not sure it qualifies for flat funding. So I think it is maybe a slightly different animal. But it seems to me that there is no question that we will want to fund this someday. So it's not as if we're saving money by not funding it today. In fact, we may be, as you point out, maybe saving money by funding it today. And it seems to me that as much as we have policies to guide us, putting those policies in concrete is not always a good idea, and having some flexibility when you have a particular opportunity that comes up makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to support funding for this project.
Other comments? Okay. Do we need any other information in order to be able to move forward? Then I would welcome a motion, either in support or not.
Madam Chair, I move to approve increasing the funding for the historic Columbia River Highway State Trail, particularly the Lindsay Creek Bench Cut, with funding from our discretionary TE program.
I believe we may need to remove the cap first. And then we would, and I think as a preamble, I do want to make sure that our commission knows that this is coming back. The discretionary fund is going, we have a dialogue that we need to have. I think we need to have a fresh conversation about these funds and the best use of these funds, aside from this policy. And I would also be looking, if we were to remove that cap, that there's a distinction between, are you motioning that we remove it in general, or that we are allowing an exception for this project? So I'll take your will of whatever that motion is.
Madam, first of all, may I withdraw my previous motion?
Absolutely.
And then I would move to suspend the cap for purposes of this particular project. And bring it back, and bring the whole program back for further discussion in the future.
Excellent. Okay. Further discussion on that motion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Nay.
Okay. So we have one nay, and the motion carries. So the next piece is the actual funding.
Madam Chair, I would move funding, to provide funding as proposed for the Lindsay Creek, let me get the title right. Help me, Ryan. The Wyeth to Lindsay Creek project, using transportation enhancement discretionary funds.
Okay. Further discussion on that motion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
And opposed?
Opposed? Nay.
Okay, thank you. And I too, just for purposes of, transparency, would have had hesitation, great hesitation, if it were a different scenario of this, the timing, I probably would have pushed back a bit more. But I appreciate the dialogue. I understand the reasons why we would move forward, and appreciate the investment of time to get us where we are, and both gentlemen making time to be here today as well. So.
Thank you. I realize it's also hard in that there's so many other needs, and how we make this a priority in light of that. But realizing that this is a dedicated fund for this specific type of purpose makes it a little easier. But I share Commissioner Brown's concern about why we have these parameters, and if we're just going to suspend them.
Exactly.
So I get it, and look forward to cycling the completed project at some point.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. Next item on the agenda is request approval for, let's see, the Oregon Department of Transportation Rail and Public Transit Division 1719 Discretionary Transit Network Intercity Grant Program. Hello, and we have Marcia with us. Hoskins, great to see you. And the floor is yours.
There. Good afternoon, Chair Boehne, Commissioners, Director Garrett. For the record, my name is Marcia Hoskins. I'm the Public Transportation Manager for the ODOT Rail and Public Transit Division. Last month, Helgard, the Division Administrator, and I presented to you on our core formula awards for the 2017-19 biennium. What I'm presenting on today is the last piece of that solicitation. It lags those other awards because the Transit Network and Intercity program is a competitive discretionary program. So it took us a bit longer to do the selection process, to assemble a committee, vet the projects, and do the process. It's a small program. We had $1.8 million available in funding. We had over $5 million worth of submitted projects. So it was for a small amount of money, it was a hard process to determine. The Transit Network and Intercity program is designed to improve connections between cities and communities, as well as enhance transportation hubs, promote economic development, access to transit, those kinds of things. In the past, we have run a solicitation that is solely intercity, funded by the Federal Transit Administration Intercity Fund Program, Section 5311F. This biennium, we were able to add a small amount of rural general public funds to this to try and make it more flexible and not limit it to long-distance inner-city connections, but also award some projects that helped with connections between communities that perhaps didn't meet the longer intercity restrictions. So our process, I want to just note that eligible applicants, besides the usual suspects of nonprofit agencies, public transit agencies and entities, and Indian tribes, for this solicitation, private for-profit agencies that do public transportation are eligible, and this is the only fund source that they are eligible for. So our process was that we collected, as I mentioned, $5 million worth of projects. It was 48 different projects. 16 agencies submitted a total of 48 projects. Our selection committee was made up of ODOT staff, our regional transit coordinators and program manager, as well as a member of our Public Transportation Advisory Committee, which was Basin Transit System Services. Ernie from Klamath Falls was our PTAC representative. He did not have an application, so he was a nice objective participant, as well as Angie Jones from Grant County Transportation District, representing a rural transit provider who didn't have an intercity application in. So this selection team reviewed and ranked project applications and created this recommended list of projects that's before you. Our criteria were, as I mentioned, around system connectivity, access, economic development, but in reality, with a small amount of money and a large amount of projects, we, in the end, also prioritized continuing existing service that was already in place. Perhaps not to the extent that folks had applied for, but we did, in the end, put a value on existing services. So, as you'll see, we have a list of projects that include mainly vehicle and preventive maintenance grants, a bit of operating funds, and some preventive, as I said, preventive maintenance awards, all of which are pretty much existing. They are all actually existing services. We didn't end up funding any new connections, but we did manage to keep all of the ones that we had in place going. So our hope is that we can grow this program because it does kind of promote some of the things that are coming out of our public transportation plan update. Connectivity is a huge theme, as I'm sure you've all heard before too. So we're asking for your approval of these 2017-19 awards, and take any questions if you have them.
Well, let me first, what a well-vetted process, and I'm very grateful to the committee for this work. And I can imagine that with $5 million of requests and not nearly as much in terms of funding, having to pick and choose is not an easy task.
No.
So thank you very much to the committee and for your work on getting to this recommendation.
You're welcome.
Do we have questions or other thoughts on this? It seems pretty straightforward, but please.
A couple of questions. I guess I would appreciate having the ability to see what the other $3 million worth of projects were that got rejected. So it's hard to compare. All we get is the final decision.
Sure.
But I don't want to hold up a decision just because of that. But in the future, it would be helpful to know the whole spectrum of the projects.
Absolutely.
Question, the Hood River, number one on your list there, from providing connection from the Dalles to Portland, is that related to the presentation we had, I think, when we were up in the gorge, about providing service to the gorge, to the Multnomah Falls? Is this part of that project, or is it something separate?
It's separate. It's existing service, but it's pretty infrequent and has no stops in between. So the Gorge Express actually has stops at Rooster Rock and Multnomah Falls. But the last portion of that federal lands grant does improve connections beyond the falls in like 2020, 2021. But this is actually supporting Hood River County Transportation District's existing intercity service that they have.
A number of these, thank you, a number of these really provide connections from rural or fairly rural parts of Oregon into the Portland area, and I think are very important for people who need to get in for critical services, particularly medical services. So some of these are really, I think, essential for us to continue. And I'm fairly familiar with the last one on the list, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, where they're providing really incredible transit service throughout that region that would be just impossible without this.
Right.
So even though it's a little bit awkward to be providing operating funds, those are the funds, some of the funds that are needed most in order to maintain these services. So I really like this program, and I'll be supporting this these grant awards.
Thank you.
Excellent. Was that a motion?
That was a motion, yes.
Oh, I thought I heard one. Okay. Do we have further discussion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion carries. Great work. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, next item on the agenda is, let me get clear here. A discussion on the implementation of the Oregon Department of Transportation's Management Review recommendations. Director Garrett, well, this is an interesting
This
change.
is intimidating looking
yes.
from this side of the table.
Yes, and Ms. Bruce, great to see you, so please.
Madam Chair, members of the Commission, I'm Matthew Garrett, have the privilege of being the Director of the Oregon Department of Transportation, and with me is Kelly Bruce. Kelly and I will speak to the implementation of the management review, and you will recall in April, Ms. Katie Koba, the state's Chief Operating Officer and the Department of Administrative Services Director, delivered recommendations on the implementation of the McKinsey Management Review and DAS's findings here. You'll recall that DAS recommended 8 specific implementation tasks, and I will paraphrase those quickly because I'm going to come back to some of the words that are embedded in those 8 tasks. The first is a charge to the governor and legislative leadership to form a work group to clarify the governance structure between the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Commission. The second charge is to have ODOT work with the Oregon Transportation Commission to examine the management structure and develop broad measures of success clothed in the garment of a 5-year business plan or strategic business plan. The third being DAS should convene a team of procurement professionals to review contracting protocols and process specific to the highway portfolio. The fourth, similar type of an efficiency effort surrounding the fleet and facilities programs here at the department. The fifth, ODOT in consultation with the Transportation Commission should develop a communication plan to close the loop with external stakeholders regarding the decision-making process. The sixth, following the approvals of the success metrics identified in the second charge here, work with the legislature to align our key performance measures. The seventh, ODOT and the Oregon Transportation Commission should ask the Secretary of State to perform an audit on the State Highway Fund management protocols and disciplines. And the eighth and final recommendation in the spring of 2020. The Governor's Office, the Transportation Commission, and ODOT need to review the progress made to determine if follow-up reviews are needed here. So there's the charge, there's the universe. If you listen closely to the 8 recommendations or tasks, you would note that 5 of the 8 call on the Transportation Commission and the Oregon Department of Transportation to jointly engage in these tasks. So it is in this spirit of a joint venture that I'd like to share with you the roadmap that we are crafting as we move to implement the recommendations provided us by the Department of Administrative Services. And to ensure that these tasks are delivered in a timely and effective manner, I want you to know that we have actually created a management review implementation steering team. It's made up of ODOT senior executives to oversee the completion and the deliverables called for in these recommendations. The roster is as follows. I have the privilege of being on point. I own this. I think it's that important. Sitting around the table with me from the ODOT executive team is Travis Brower, our Deputy Director, Paul Mather, our Highway Division Administrator, Robert Gephardt, who is our Chief Administrative Officer, Tom Fuller, ODOT's Communication Manager, Ms. Bruce here, who is the ODOT Process Improvement Manager, but taking the lead position in terms of putting this effort together. Carmen Four of the Governor's Office sits around that table as well. So, Madam Chair, what I'd like to lay on the table right now is I think it is important and appropriate that we have a Transportation Commission member or members, no more than 2, because of quorum type issues, to fill this role, to help inform, again, in the spirit of a joint venture. So I will ask you to consider that, noodle on that, and hopefully provide a name or names to fill out the implementation steering team. Now, not only have we formed this team, we've also gone as far as assigning executive sponsors and project managers for each of the tasks that are being led internally here. We're developing the project kickoff plan. This task will be identified in terms of process, in terms of key milestones, in terms of our schedules, and then the host of disciplines that we need to bring around it to help inform and move forward on the various tasks. These folks who make up this implementation team have the reach throughout the whole of the agency, if not internal, external as well, to bring folks in to inform the overall conversation. It is our intent to develop a monthly report on the status of each and every task. This report will be posted on the internet. It will be shared monthly with the Commission. We will have a standing agenda item that we bring before the Commission. We will also share it with the ODOT family, all our employees, as well as stakeholders. We want to shine a very bright light on the execution of this implementation plan. It is our expectation that the first report that we will bring back to the Commission will be at next month's meeting, the June meeting. Now, the linchpin of this effort, I believe, will be the agency's strategic business plan. Simply put, I see this plan ensuring strategic alignment between the Commission, between agency leadership, and the overall ODOT workforce. We seek a 5-year strategic plan document that clearly articulates ODOT's visions, goals, priorities, the key strategies, and that it will include developing an ODOT vision, because if you look closely, we have a mission, we have goals, we don't have a vision, and I think that's an opportunity to ensure that our vision is not only near-term, but long-term in its perspective. Performance metrics based on the strategic plan document will enable measurement of ODOT's success in achieving these tasks and achieving these goals. We'll bring clarity about the alignment, as well as the gaps between the strategic business plan and ODOT's current division, branch, section, individual goals, priorities, and activities. We must implement a plan that clearly aligns our divisions, again, our branches, our sections, and the individual goals to this strategic plan, enables executive and managers to provide leadership in articulating the vision, goals, and priorities, enables employees at all levels of the organization to understand the vision, goals, and priorities. There's a simple story that we use. In the 1960s, if you worked for NASA, whether you were an astronaut or a janitor, you knew your job was to get a man in space and eventually get a man on the moon. And down the line, from the top to the most current hired, that was the mantra of folks from NASA, to get a man in space, to get a man on the moon. A similar type of discipline. It's a good story that reiterates the type of protocol and discipline we need to put in place here. We will promote higher accountability for achieving our vision, goals, and practices in this document as well. So the strategic plan will inform not only itself, but also the other tasks in terms of the key performance measures. We talk about aligning that with our legislative conversation. I would also submit that the business plan may indeed inform the structure of the agency. We may have to pause and reflect. Are we structured to deliver and achieve the goals that we come up with here? So we are moving at a very fast pace. Time is not a commodity we have, given the due dates that are embedded in the recommendations. So we're going to move very quickly. And in moving that, I had to bring one of the best and brightest individuals to help deliver this plan and actually help manage this plan forward here. And now I'd like to turn to Kelly Bruce, who will walk through the plan and ask some additional questions of the Commission. So with that, I'd stand down, happy to answer any questions, but I'll pass the baton to Ms. Bruce.
Do we have questions for the director before we move on? Okay, Ms. Bruce.
Okay. Thank you, Director Garrett, Chair Bainey, and Commission members. For the record, my name is Kelly Bruce. He's already done a good job of introducing me. So today I want to talk to you primarily about the procurement process. We are going to hire a consultant that is experienced that can help us through this process. I think that will provide an external perspective that will push us, I think, to challenge our thinking. So we are in the process of developing that request for proposal. The timeframes, as Director Garrett alluded to, are in attachment 2. You should have a copy of that. They're very aggressive, very ambitious. But this is to allow, given the timeframes that DAS provided us to accomplish this, we really wanted to have a very high quality product. So we want to have as much time as possible for the consultant to work and for us to do our work. The evaluation process, we're looking at 3 key phases to that. One is around the proposal scoring piece, where we'll be looking at experience and their approach and value to the organization. We're also going to look for examples of what they've done. Interview process will then move the highest scoring proposers will move to the interview process. So we want to have an interview phase. And of course, the cost phase will be the last piece of that. As Director Garrett mentioned, we see the commission as our key partner in this effort. And so we're incorporating language into the RFP to that extent so that it's a joint venture. And our intent is to engage you throughout the entire process. So I would ask Chair Bainey and commissioners for a volunteer from the commission to sit on the evaluation committee as well as the interview committee. We'd prefer it to be one person, the same person, because it'll provide a valuable continuity, but we can also work around schedules. We know that's a challenge. So if one of you wants to participate in one and one in the other, that's totally fine. And we'd ask that you would just get back to us with names for that within a short time frame, because we're in the process of scheduling now. Any questions on that so far?
No, but I will say that given the importance of this work and given the partnership between, that we really are in lockstep, I would like to participate in that. And so that is why I would like to welcome a commissioner to join me. I do understand that the turnaround is quick, and so we will need to have that information of who might be interested yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Bainey.
Yes.
So I would like.
Sorry,
I'm sorry,
Commissioner O'Halloran.
Just to comment, and maybe a question is, in light of how the management review was intended to be an independent view, and we're doing this all internally, should we have a touch base, a checkpoint with DAS along the way here? And I wanted to make sure that we're doing this in a credible way, that if they just see it as, hey, we're implementing, is it consistent with their guidance to us? Does it meet the criteria? And is it checking the box on what legislators and others wanted as we're proceeding, to make sure that we have that perspective? It's not just us looking at ourselves.
Madam Chair, I agree with that, and given the little bit of a stumble that occurred in the hiring for the management review, I would wonder if it wouldn't make sense to have somebody from DAS on this review and interview committee, at least somebody outside of the department who's got clear credibility. And I think DAS proved over the course of time through the management review that they really did have that credibility and acceptance on the part of the public, even some of the critics. So I think this is an important stage, choosing this consultant. And I would agree. I think it might make sense to include them at the outset.
I think, Madam Chair, if I may, to Commissioner O'Halloran and Commissioner Loma's question, I'd be happy to engage Director Koba and have just this conversation to make sure that, again, for continuity, since DAS did handle the last contracting initiative, that if they want to bring someone forward and populate it, I don't think it hurts us, and it actually advances the cause. So happy to do that.
And before we go too far from engaging DAS, is it our opinion that we are pressed too much in order to have the best outcome? because those deadlines, now that we're putting them into reality, I would feel comfortable if we were to signal too aggressive. I don't want us to limit the caliber of individuals that we may be able to work with purely by a timeline. So thoughts on that?
I think, Madam Chair, my initial thoughts on that is we're going to have to react to the firms that react to the proposal.
Right.
And again, it may play itself out with just that type of comment. What you're asking for cannot be accomplished in a time frame, or it can be, but it will cost you more. And I think those are the real discussions here. But until we actually cast the net and see what comes back, I'd rather than grasp at a specter, I'd rather wait till something comes back here. Because again, the timeframes are embedded in that set of recommendations, and they have been handed off to us to deliver.
Excellent. Well, just know that you'll have my support if we end up needing to ask for extra time. I think the outcome is far more important than the deadline. So just as a comment.
But I would say, if we're able to issue this RFP tomorrow, and they have until basically a month from now to respond, that's a reasonable amount of time. That doesn't rushing them too much, I don't think. Most contractors are used to operating in that kind of a time frame.
Just putting it out there that if we find ourselves, I don't want us to feel like we're backing into something just for the simple fact that it's on the paper. I want to make sure that we're moving forward in a way that best serves the goal that we're trying to achieve. So,
Thank you, I understand. I would like to now move you to attachment 1, page 2. There's a table there for the anticipated tasks and deliverables, so I just wanted to quickly walk you through that, just so you have an understanding of what we're asking the consultant to do. So the first task is around creating a baseline assessment of ODOT strategic planning as it stands today. So what are our initiatives? What is the work that we're doing currently? And being able to kind of lay that foundation of where we're at today with that. Task 2 would be around connecting the actual strategic business planning process. And we do expect that to have extensive engagement both internally and externally. We want employees at all levels engaged, as well as our leadership teams, our management teams, and our partners. The third task is around developing the success metrics and the key performance measures that will support us achieving that plan and be able to measure our progress and how well we're doing towards that. The fourth task is actually it's 2 tasks in one. It's conducting the gap analysis. Once the strategic business plan is identified and approved, then we go back to the baseline and compare and look at what's the gaps, what do we need to adjust, what do we need to stop doing potentially, start doing differently, all of those types of things, and have that identification. And then we want them to help us build an implementation plan. So that's where the alignment will take place, and it will inform strategic planning all the way down to the lower levels. With that, we also want to include a change management strategies embedded in that, because we fully expect this to be a shift in the organization. And like Director Garrett mentioned, the story of NASA and putting a man on the moon, we want our employees to be able to have that same reaction. If we ask them what they do, we're putting a man on the moon. So that's what we're trying to get to here. Obviously, we're not going to put a man on the moon, but we want them to have that same.
don't limit us.
Well, it's true. We could be headed towards the Jetson age. And then task 5 is a contingency task, and that is basically to enable us to utilize the consultant to actually help us with the implementation if we feel that we need it. So we wanted to have that set aside and have that flexibility if we want to use that at the lower levels versus trying to do that ourselves. Any questions on those? Actually, Chair Boehning and Commission, what I'd like to know is, do these meet your expectations? Is there something that you see missing? Do we need to adjust these in any way?
Please.
The only thing that occurs to me, and it may well be implicit in here, but it would be helpful to have a consultant who's pretty familiar with what's going on elsewhere in the states. Now, I know, Matt, you have contacts with other ODOT or other DOT directors around the state. A number of them have strategic plans already. And I know as we've put together.
The country?
Pardon? What did I say?
The
In the country, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Like other states.
Oh.
Yeah.
I know as we've worked on the freight plan and other plans, we've looked to other states and tried to learn from their good ideas and failed ideas. And I think similarly here, making sure that we have somebody who can take advantage of stumbles or good things that people have learned elsewhere would be very helpful. And I would hope, Matt, that you'll be using your peers just informally to gather information.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Ullman, I already have, as a matter of fact. I think it's, you want to be best in class. And recall some of the conversation around the McKinsey report as we were held up against our brothers and sisters across the nation at DOTs. We fared pretty well. I also want to make that statement as we move to the future, that when we're held up against world-class private sector organizations, that we fare pretty well. We have a ways to go. That was the opportunity that came with the McKinsey and DAS recommendations here. I will maximize and exhaust the opportunities with my brothers and sisters at other dots where I think that's the kind of dot I want to be, go to school on it. And that's actually already started, just so you know. So
good.
More to come.
So the question for us right now, the scope of work essentially, are there additions or outside of what has been proposed? Maybe we need to clarify that that piece is also something that we want them to look into. Is there anything else that seems to be missing or that we would omit? Please.
At what point, so just to clarify, the consultant will help dig deeper into these particular tasks, right?
Thank you, Commissioner Simpson. We expect the consultant to actually perform these tasks and deliverables.
So when we're talking about things like performance measures, it's up to them to determine what performance measures they want to identify that we should be measuring, or is it up to maybe the group, or is it up to the steering team to identify that? I'm just trying to figure out how that...
No, I think you've got it. It is that dynamic process. We hope to secure, let's say, the best and brightest in the field that actually can look at what's transpiring across the nation, identify the charge given to this agency, look at the key performance measures we have that exist right now, and saying if your future state needs to be X, you need to better focus in these areas. You have some key performance measures that do that. You have others that need to be refined, and you have others that have nothing to do with this new charge. So that expertise will inform the conversation with the folks making up the implementation steering committee team and the project task team. We're not bringing folks in to lead us. We're bringing folks in here to work with us, and we're going to maximize the intellect and the experience that they bring to inform that conversation to arrive at that future state.
But if I understand correctly, ultimately, things like performance measures will be decided by this commission. There'll be proposals that come from the consultant and refinements that come from the steering committee, but ultimately the commission will decide.
I think that's a fair assessment. There is a process here. First, I would say we'd have a consultant. This joint venture, ODOT and the OTC will inform. In the budgetary conversation, the key performance measures are approved by the commission, and then eventually it is the legislature that approves the key performance measures. So you can see there is a kind of a sequential discipline that'll follow that gets us to the final result. But our job, I think, is to focus and refine and truly target outcomes, and how we measure those will become, I think, the new family of key performance measures for our agency.
Other comments on that particular piece? Okay.
Okay, so I think Director Garrett has already addressed most of our next steps. We do hope to open the RFP on Monday. That's our goal. And we'll just continue to engage you throughout the process. So.
If I may, and I do appreciate the council of bringing a partner from DAS on board. to Commissioner Holloran's question about the legislative involvement. Understand they have their own conversation around accountability and efficiencies of the agency that will complement and inform that. We'll see what plays itself out during that funding conversation. That's not lost on us. That will help inform some of these conversations. I'm going to ask a lot of my people. I'm going to ask a lot of the commission. The gravity of this can't be lost or overstated here. And so not only do I need commission input in the implementation team effort, but I would also ask to begin to think about, as proposals come in, I would like commission oversight and insight. As we select a candidate or sets of candidates, I would like commission input sitting around the table as we make a decision of what private sector firm are we going to partner with. And then once we do that, I would like commission, counsel, and input as we negotiate with these folks. So we have this scope of work, but there's a refinement that takes place in terms of nailing down that final agreement. And I think, again, in the spirit of a joint venture, we're sitting next to each other and forming that overall conversation because we are talking about the future of both our organizations when you really boil this down to a very simple sentence. So with that, Madam Chair, appreciate this opportunity. No, we will be back with presentations and with documents that articulate the milestones where we are specific to each of these tasks. And we'll continue this conversation, and we will do our very best to position this agency and this commission for success.
Commissioner, please.
One last question. So in the RFP, I'm curious about the point structure. How are those points broken out and what categories are they? And could we just highlight that really quickly? Because I'm more curious about the firm that is, going to be selected, the winning proposer, what their experience is historically in terms of developing these types of strategies and plans, and how they've been able to measure that success.
Thank you, Commissioner Simpson. So we are still working through the final details around that, but we're structuring the points so that the value and the experience and the quality and their approach are the highest scored, and the cost will be important, but won't be as high. So we're really looking for the value piece as the highest piece there. So their qualifications, their experience, we'll really be looking at their experience delivering a similar type of project and planning process.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is a note to us. This is an important time, and it almost feels as though we're growing up, really getting to that next iteration of the agency and of the OTC. And I think this is a lot will be asked of us as individuals, and we've already noted that our meetings will be a bit longer, but the engagement will be, I think, at least in the next year, a lot more than it has been in the past. So I appreciate the update, and I look forward to working with you, and we'll get back to you on another individual soon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, next item on the agenda, we have discussion. Oh, I wanted to note, and I wanted to also give an apology to Ms. Ramsdell. We very much are looking forward to your update and overview, but thank you for offering us the gift of time. We're going to put that onto another agenda, and we will move on to engaging in a discussion on tolling and congestion pricing policy and potential applications and opportunities. So, Ms. Bohard? You are without a partner.
He's coming.
Okay, great.
I'd be lost. So, good afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Jerry Bohard, TDD Division Administrator, and with me is Chris Warren from Cambridge Systematics. Chris is really going to be doing, I think, most of the presentation, but I think, obviously, you've all been hearing, and Director Garrett spoke a great deal about the funding package and the conversation that's been happening around tolling. So we just thought it'd be really helpful for you to get some background information, ask some questions, just get a good foundation relative to that. I think that Commissioner Loma may have been the only one around when we did the tolling discussion back in 2009, I believe. So this is really supposed to be discussion, so I think don't hesitate to interrupt. At the end of the Chris's presentation, I'll just give you a little bit of the rules and statutes that we have in place and that the commission has put in place already. The other thing I'll say is that we're working, again, with Cambridge sort of on a white paper, educational paper. We haven't finalized it yet, so depending on what we hear today, we'll be thinking about if there's any changes we need to make to that. But you also have sort of some take-home reading probably in the next week or so that I think will complement what you hear from this discussion today. So I think with that, oh, yep, where is the mouse? That's a good question. Oh, there it is. Great. The trick question. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to encourage you to stop me at any time and ask questions. This is meant to help you understand sort of the scope and nature of this type of work. So what I want to do is basically start with a sort of an overview of how tolling might work, all the different forms and what's involved. Then get into some of the trade-offs in the various methods, and I especially throughout this want to contrast it with what your current portfolio funding looks like in the state and how these sources have advantages or disadvantages compared to your existing portfolio. And then I'm going to do a brief overview of the federal authorization that you would need to proceed with any tolling and what's out there at the moment. And then Jerry's going to kick back in and cover some of the context. So with that, over the past 30 years, you've been using gas tax like most states to cover a significant amount of your funding, less so than other states. And so it's important to understand what's happening to that source before you look at tolling. It's a source of money that works in many ways. It's regarded as somewhat different than your taxes, general taxes. So let's just start with the context here that over 30 years, the gas tax in the state has been raised. If you look at the rate per gallon, this is generally the picture that you see going back to 1979, where you've raised it. And that tells you something, but it doesn't tell you as much as you really want to know as a funding source. What probably we do most when we look at these portfolios is we adjust it. We adjust it for the fact that it has to be spent on the amount of demand out there on the roadway and how you're going to deal with that demand. So one way to do that is to divide it by the amount of vehicle miles of travel. How much travel do you have? And the state has been growing economically and immigration. And as a result, the gas tax revenue, the total amount of revenue you're earning has gone up. And you don't see this decline that most states have seen, that as the mileage of the vehicles on the road improves, you're collecting a lot less gas per gallon, tax per gallon. You haven't seen that because the state has been growing, so it keeps adding more funds to the pot. The economists in the state are predicting that you're going to hit a decline soon. I forget when it's coming up. I think they're saying 2020 basically is when it maxes out. But if you look at the amount of tax you're collecting on a VMT basis, and you start with just current dollars, starting in 1979, we see this growth trend going up. And if you notice, when we divide it by the amount of demand out there, it has gone up. The amount of revenue you're collecting per mile of travel has gone up slightly. But if we adjust that for inflation in 2016 dollars, the trend you see is not as severe as what we've seen in many states, but it is still flat, basically, in terms of the amount of tax you're collecting. So despite all these increases in gas tax, you haven't really collected more money on a per mile basis. Something to keep in mind, just the background, the context. Any questions about that? Or good, okay, great. So let's look at your current portfolio funding. A lot of states, where I came from in California, we use sales tax to fund a lot of transportation. It has nothing to do with driving. In your state, you have three main sources of taxes, nothing to do with transportation, really. Perhaps property tax a little bit, but not really. The other side of the portfolio are user fees. And we like user fees as economists because user fees send a price signal to a user. They say, if you want to use a park, you're going to pay an entrance fee. If you're going to use a copy machine at the recorder's office, you're going to pay a user fee. In gas taxes, we think of them as user fees because we're charging motorists, but they don't send much of a price signal. They really straddle that line between taxes and user fees. I doubt very many motorists even know what the gas tax is they're paying at the pump or think about it when they get a thing. So it's not, there isn't much of a price signal, which is fine. It's one of its advantages. I think it's an invisible tax. Most of us don't see it. Politically, it's very easy to do. You have VMT fees, which send a stronger price signal. Again, only car owners pay that, and it's applied to users. That's about 21% of the portfolio, and the remaining comes from your weight distance tax, which is a really phenomenal user fee in many ways. From an economic standpoint, we like it a lot. There are only 4 states in the country that collect weight distance taxes, and frankly, Oregon does it the best. I could tell you some stories about the way it's done in New Mexico that don't work at all. So you're already, in a sense, dealing with user fees and tolling in that form of portfolio. Any questions? Okay. So with that, I'm going to start with the most important thing about looking at any form of tolling, and that is to be very clear-eyed about what are your goals, what are you trying to achieve. And there's sort of 4 categories of goals that we think about when we do tolling. The first is financial, and obviously the revenue side comes to bear. You're trying to increase the amount of revenues, especially if the gas tax is flat in terms of real dollars per mile of travel or demand. Are you looking for ways to supplement that portfolio and add something that's a little more resistant, or in this case, completely resistant to the amount of travel? You collect more, the more travel. So the other thing that tolling can do from a revenue standpoint is it can leverage private investment. There aren't many other sources, but when you come up with a tolling project, very often private sector companies worldwide have invested in tolling, and they leverage the amount of public money you have. And we can talk more about that if you have questions. The Trump infrastructure proposal has a lot of leverage in it, and therefore would probably look at tolling projects as one way to do that. It can also accelerate the amount of project delivery. On the other side, though, on the financial side, is to, instead of increasing the amount of capacity on the roadway by tolling and building more capacity, you could use tolling to decrease the demand, especially at peak period, by congestion pricing. And that sort of has a financial consequences that you don't have to build as much capacity when you're getting people to divert to off-peak travel outside the peak, reducing congestion, or to other routes or to other modes like transit. So there's a financial trade-off there. The more you go towards congestion pricing, the less revenue you raise. There are congestion pricing projects that generate plenty of revenue. The second set of goals have to do with the social goals, and there's an equity side to tolling. There's a lot of people that feel that if you're taking up space on the road with an electric vehicle or a hybrid, you're just as impactful to the demand for transportation as, you know, a pickup truck, and therefore you shouldn't be paying less at the pump for the amount of space that you take up on the road. So there's an equity concern there, but there's also a concern about its impact on low-income households and how it affects them. It does improve, in some ways, low-income households or other people that use a lot of transit because they avoid the toll. So there's some options that come along, same as a gas tax, that are helpful. The other side of the social thing is all the environmental concerns, reducing GHG and lowering the amount of travel we do, noise and other accidents and problems that come with car travel. This has become one of the ideas behind a carbon tax idea that we would charge tolls based on the amount of pollution you put out. Third set of goals have to do with geographical. When you toll a corridor, a specific corridor, that creates an ability for local cities and regions to control the kinds of money and where they want to build capacity. It gives them a local tool. You're already doing that with gas tax. There are 22 cities in the state that have a local option gas tax. So this is a more flexible way to provide that local control or quarter specific. You can also go the other side and look at a statewide program, which is some of where Origo has been sort of pilot testing the notion of a statewide tax. And that, in that case, it can be used to supplement or to replace the fuel tax. Some of the states looking at this have looked at it as a revenue neutral swap. We're not going to increase the amount of revenue we're collecting from you. We're just going to do it through tolls instead of gas taxes. Okay, I don't want to take too much time. Finally, on a political set of goals, what are you trying to achieve there? There's been a very go-slow, incremental approach to tolling around the country. We see a lot of states and regions looking at tolling as something new. Now the bridge tolling's been around ever since bridges were invented, but tolling roads, tolling special lanes, all that, there's been a very incremental approach. I will say that as a state, since you haven't developed an HOV network, that strategy is the principal method of incrementally introducing tolling into an area. That it's the most benign political way to do it, because all you're saying is if you're a single occupant driver, you can use the HOV lane, but you pay a toll. So it hasn't created much of a political backlash. There are fights over whether the HOV requirement should be a 2+ or a 3+. There's a fight whether these SOV drivers are clogging the HOV lane. There's exemptions for electric cars. There are challenges, but it's a much easier strategy to introduce. An aggressive, ambitious strategy would leverage a lot of what we're hearing now is the whole pending, who knows, 2, 5, 10 years out when we see automated vehicles on the road. Most of the, I should be careful here. Most of the new vehicles being produced today already have the technology on board to do what's called open road tolling. So there's an opportunity here through the technology to be more aggressive if you wanted to go on a statewide basis. And that gives an opportunity for some places to look at this as a more global strategy. All right, any questions about sort of these goals? Yeah, sure.
May I ask a question? So on that last point, open road tolling, congestion pricing, since congestion pricing is somewhat of a subset of tolling.
It is.
That has application there, the technology.
It does.
Actually allows you to enter into it, and that gets back to some of the Origo conversations in terms of the mileage-based fee. They kind of converge there over time, don't they?
They do. And Matt, you bring up a really good point that congestion pricing is just a subset of tolling. It allows you, and I'll talk about that next slide in a second, but the technology is definitely making an Origo type program now much more feasible, less of a lift. And when we do move to automated vehicles at some point, or I guess we could say if, that it provides even more. I want to talk about 8 different types of tolling projects, and most of these could apply in Oregon. Some require more political change than others. But basically, what we see here, imagine a couple of cities connected by an interstate. If we roughly, and I'm going to be, think about them in terms of how likely is it the public would accept these types of projects in terms of what we've seen in the past and around the country. Building a bypass, a new road around a city, that's done a lot, and tolling it, not really a particularly challenging politically thing to do, and we see that a lot. It's been done all over the country where you have new capacity and you want to add it. It's even better if there's a bridge on that road, a pinch point where everybody's got to go through, because that tends to deal with some of the diversion issues and evasion. But that project's pretty easy. Another one then is to build a whole new express lane. Express lanes simply give you the option, whether you're an SOV or a carpool, to use a segregated set of lanes and get past all the congestion, and you pay for that travel time savings. Again, not a heavy lift politically relative to these other projects. We've looked at truck toll lanes. They're challenging, frankly. There is some interest. We do a lot of work in the ports of LA and Long Beach and Los Angeles, which has the highest truck traffic in the world. And we haven't found a feasible truck lane project there, but that doesn't mean there aren't some that would work. And there are a few other places we're working where they might. Again, specific user fee applied to a dedicated facility again, not so hard. Okay, moving into the more challenging type of thing is to widen a bridge or rebuild it and then toll it. Now, at this point, you're applying tolls to an existing facility, and that's when it gets politically challenging. But when you do something like this and you add capacity or you do something, it helps, and most users accept that. Same thing true with building a new high occupancy toll lane, what are called hot lanes. The idea is carpool and tolling. Again, not so hard. Replacing or expanding a particular bottleneck and tolling that, it can work. It's harder politically, but it's also very much subject to diversion and evasion, and so we'll talk more about that. But it's not as challenging as the next set of projects, which are to price existing lanes. That hasn't been done yet, and it's sort of the most challenging thing that most of us are looking at this option don't see politically very likely to happen anytime soon. But it has been discussed. In some places, there are just no options available for other ways to do it. Finally, there is this model that has been successfully deployed in 4 cities now, 2 in Sweden. Singapore started a cordon pricing program in 72 or 79 or something, 79. And it's been very successful. And then London introduced it. Ken Livingstone, the mayor there, took what many considered the biggest political risk anybody could, but it was introduced and it's proved to be pretty effective. And he went on to serve a couple more terms, so it can be done. There's been a couple of attempts in the United States to do cordon pricing. Mayor Bloomberg tried it in New York and was stopped by the legislature. San Francisco won what was called a VPP program, Value Pilot Pricing Program, and was beaten back. And we can talk more about why that was the case. But anyway, so that's sort of the lay of the land. Any questions about all the kinds of tolling thing? Okay. All right. So I think we're out of the, yeah, please.
Go.
Yeah.
Just the last comment, cordon tolling.
Yeah.
So nothing's transpired in the States, but internationally it's happened. Let's go to London.
Yeah.
Cordon tolling there. You just identify every route into the city. Is that how it's accomplished? Is it done electronically?
Yeah.
Are there and just what's the mechanics
Right.
behind that?
So they set up what might be known as a geofence, and that's a nice term to ban around because if it were done in the United States or done in neighborhoods, it sets up a way that if you cross this threshold, in the case of London, they were eager to deploy it, so they used something called vehicle plate recognition. They had all these cameras that read license plates, and then you were sent a bill, and you had a certain amount of time to pay the bill. It was very expensive. They spent 30% of the revenues developing and maintaining that system. Singapore, after they introduced a very manual system, went to a GPS-type geofencing, and that was becoming much less expensive. I think Stockholm, which went in with an all-GPS system, they dropped the price down to less than 5% of the annual revenues that were collected to run the system. They had a very expensive deployment, and Matt, to your question, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole if it's not interesting, but both Stockholm and London were politically very smart about it. In London, for all of his political bravery, Ken Livingstone basically said everybody inside the cordon is exempt from the toll. If you're driving within the cordon and you live inside the cordon, you don't have to pay for it. Well, in London, that turned out to be some of the most politically potent communities, and therefore it was widely supported because not only did they not have to pay for it, but all the riffraff did, and it reduced congestion and it improved transit. So it was a win-win-win for them. Stockholm paid IBM a fortune to develop a pilot program for a year. It was deployed as an experiment with a guarantee that it would be withdrawn after a year, and everybody gets to vote on it, which is what they did. But when they drew the voting district around Stockholm, the cynics say they described it in a way that allowed for just enough of the suburbs to vote on it who were paying the toll versus the people inside who weren't, that it looked like a fair election, but the majority inside the city, same as London, said, hey, this is great. We're getting all the upsides and all the downsides. So there's a politics to this that can work. Probably, you could color it green, really, and say it's very feasible.
Is that because the people inside did not own vehicles?
No, they do. They drive around. They just don't pay the toll. You're charged at the geofence where you cross the border. Now, you could set it up that you would pay inside as well. It could be what's called an open road or a VMT type charge, but that's not the way it's been done.
Madam Chair, just one, and you don't have to answer this now, but it would be nice if you have this information. Of the 8 types of tolling disciplines that you've just described, can you articulate the spade work and the time needed to prepare for them?
Yeah.
And that's just something if we could get back so
Sure.
we don't suck the time out of this conversation, because that's probably a bunny hole discussion.
Well, obviously, all the new construction comes with the time to build the facility, and so that doesn't change. But for the other ones, tolling existing facilities, tolling existing bridge, it's easy to deploy. The electronics now are pretty well established. Any other questions about those things? Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and get through this. There are 3 sort of charts I want to show you that talk about the trade-offs. And I apologize. I'm trying to pack a lot of stuff into these 3 charts. So if any part of this is confusing, I'm going to try and do it this way. On the bottom here, we're looking at a spectrum between, I've mashed up 3 things, and each one can be talked about separately. But one of the downsides of tolling is they come with higher sort of challenges to overcome than obviously a gas tax, for example, or DMV fees. There's diversion. People get around. They don't want to pay the toll, so they avoid it. There's evasion. They just simply, break the law and find ways not to pay it. And then in order to avoid that evasion, you need enforcement, and a lot of these comes with enforcement. On the other side of this sort of matrix, if you will, are the amount of user inconvenience that you're imposing on people, and tolls definitely provide that. Gas taxes are really easy to apply and check. You only have 9 or 12 terminals in the state, and they have racks, literally racks. They call it a rack tax, where the trucks that drive up and fill up with the fuel, they're charged right there. So it's very low evasion very, very low collection costs to collect gas tax. It's like 0.3 cents per dollar of gas tax that you collect. According to pricing, I said was close to 5 cents per dollar or higher for tolling. And very low, there is evasion for gas tax. In fact, let's talk about this. Here's the gas tax, or the fuel tax, okay? And so this mashup of these 3 things on the bottom here, in the case of gas tax, not quite right. There is evasion because of diesel fuel. You can buy it as a heating oil, and nationally they think evasion on diesel fuel is up north of 25%, roughly that. DMVs, again, higher user inconvenience. You got to go in and do it every year. Definitely aware of how much you're paying. So it's, it does send a signal to that degree. I don't know what the evasion is on that or the enforcement, but I suspect it's certainly going to be a higher challenge than it is for a fuel tax. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on weight distance tax. That's particularly to the truck industry. Again, pretty inconvenient, although the new technology is making weigh-in motion and other things a lot easier. So it's come down in terms of inconvenience. Okay, let's look at those types of tolling, and I'm going to look at about 4 or 5. Bridge tolls, again, easy to do, inconvenient. You got to queue up on the bridge, but now with electronic tolling, they're improving that, and it's not nearly. And the size, the amount of revenue you can collect. For a bridge, you can pay for the whole thing, and I probably should have pointed that out. Most bridge tolls do a very good job of paying for the cost of the bridge and then some. In the Bay Area, we toll all the bridges, and we're funding billions of dollars of improvements, transit operations, and all sorts of things. So, clearly a revenue generator in that regard. Express lanes, again, only drivers get to choose whether they use it or not. It's harder to evade, but it does have some costs of enforcement. And If you choose to use it, then you pay, so all drivers use it. I mean, it's not that. Hot lanes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on unless you're planning to go down that route, but it's worthwhile to see where it fits because it is the most prevalent form of tolling we see in the United States right now in terms of new roadway tolling and not bridge tolling. Cordon pricing, we talked about pretty high user inconvenience. You got to get a tag. There's all sorts of enforcement challenges and other things associated with that. And the VMT fees, if you did go to a complete substitution of fuel taxes or other taxes with the VMT fees, that's some of the policies that are being looked at around the country. Definitely higher inconvenience, definitely an enforcement challenge, although we're beginning to find technology that will deal with that. I want to move on. The second of the three.
If we could have
Sure.
You had mentioned an HOV network is the best entry into tolling, essentially.
Yes.
Do you have examples of other states that are dipping their toe in that realm and setting up a network that we could look to, or are there other? You had mentioned you didn't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I'd love to know if there are other examples we could look into.
Yeah, and in the white paper, I'll give you the firm number, but I think there might be north of a dozen or more states that have HOV networks. And we see extensive HOV networks in California and Washington to the north and south of you.
Anyone who's done it recently in terms of today's challenges of maybe, was Washington recent?
Yeah, they're, well, I don't know how far back they go. They go back, I think, 5-10 years.
Okay.
Yeah. California is longer than that, 15 to 20. And again, a lot of these systems started out as, they all started out as carpool lanes, HOV lanes, and then they've been transitioning to hot lanes. Initially because there was plenty of capacity left in them. In other words, there weren't enough carpools, so why not? Now they're becoming quite congested, a lot of them. And so and the tolls are what are called dynamic. They adjust according to the time of day, and some have evolved to the point where they adjust on the amount of traffic in them. So if you're driving in Orange County on SR 91, the toll is $12, the highest, I think, or maybe it's gone up to 15 now, I forget. They keep raising the maximum. But that tells you you're going to save a lot of time. Whereas off-peak, where you aren't going to save much time, might be $1 or $2. So the toll tells the drivers, if you're in a hurry, this is going to save you a lot of time based on the price. And it's meant to price it so that you keep enough SOVs out of it that it maintains a minimum amount of speed.
Okay.
So that's the system, that's the approach used. And I wouldn't expect to see, I would expect to see any new conversions of HOV to hot lanes to have that dynamic approach to it.
And it's not lost on me of our congestion and capacity issues existing today in Oregon, but just looking at all options on the table, I'd love to dive into that a little more.
That's right.
Please.
I don't understand your comment that the VMT fee system would be, has a lot of user inconvenience. I mean,
Well, it moves VMT, and I want to be very careful in the terms I use. When I say VMT, I'm talking about a road user charge, open road tolling, where you would be applying it to anybody who gets on the road. And that means that you have to have an account, so we can charge you when you move, and that means usually through a GPS device. There is a notion that you could read odometers and just charge on a flat rate per mile, doesn't matter where or when you go. So that is an alternative.
yeah, well, for the record, I want to say that the Origo program is not inconvenient at all. It really works extremely well.
No, it does, you're right, but you volunteer for the program, so clearly, if you went universal, it'd take a lot of people who probably wouldn't feel this is, yeah, exactly. But yes, your point's well taken.
May I just ask one question? Specific to HOV lanes, and then I think application to hot lanes, are there thresholds in terms of the length, thresholds in terms of the volumes? What's the indicator species that you're going to be successful if you drop something down right now? I think the outcome is time saving, as you said, the person's willing to
Right.
pay $15 to save 15 minutes or whatever it is.
Exactly. So it's a great question, Matt, and there's a whole area that we're moving into now called shared mobility or mobility as a service that looks at exploiting and using HOVs in the way and hot lanes in a way that they haven't been used but have tremendous potential. And what it basically looks at is ways to match people. If the HOV network is extensive enough and saves you enough time, it becomes a real incentive to form a carpool and to ride share. And what we see in some places, whether it's in DC with the slug lines, if you're familiar with those, or in the casual carpool in the Bay Area, is people getting into strangers' cars as a way to use the HOV network and save a lot of time. So while there isn't a firm, standard amount of percentage of time savings that seems to tip you into changing your behavior and driving, ride sharing versus driving alone, the more travel time savings you get from a vast or a more extensive HOV network, the more likely you are to increase the vehicle occupancy. Having said that, nationally, HOV lanes have had a pretty, I think, mediocre change in vehicle occupancy and carpooling. Nationally, I think the statistic is about 1.2 passengers per vehicle in the HOV lanes. Now that includes SOVs using the lanes tolled. So there are some ideas to be more aggressive and say, well, let's go with only 3+ per lane. Let's go with transit only. You only can run buses during peak period in the HOV lane. So there are policies within this that would allow you to be more effective. But one of the things we're looking to really explore with these new software platforms is to do peer-to-peer carpooling, where you would match yourself with a driver based on the time and the place they want to go, and potentially even social dimensions. You only want to travel with women under 30, or you want to have somebody who has a bike rack on their car. So with the new social platforms, there's some real potential to leverage HOV networks. And I'm sorry, I don't want to get into areas, but.
No, but it piques our interest in terms of
Exactly.
our ways of thinking creatively about solving our issues.
Yes,
Thank you.
I think it has tremendous potential, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. Okay. Last set of trade-offs, I think it's the last time, maybe there's one more. Again, I want to look at public acceptance, because that is, frankly, one of the biggest bugaboos about tolling, is it just getting the public's head around getting away, or the gas tax is so invisible. So clearly, public acceptance for gas tax is very high. It's used universally, and it has no privacy concerns that I'm aware of. DMV's maybe slightly more privacy concerns. There were some hacks of DMV network stuff, but again, we don't see much problem with it. And again, public acceptance seems to be very high on that. I don't think we want to spend much time on truck weight distance and whether that, I know the trucking industry hates it, and so clearly, I imagine the rest of the population thinks it's a great idea. Moving on. Let's look at these other sources. Bridge tolls, again, highly accepted. You get to a bridge. I mean, as I said, I think bridge tolls were invented 6 minutes after the first bridge was built, so I don't think a problem. Hot lanes, again, you opt in to pay the toll, so not a problem. There are people who call them Lexus lanes and regard them as somewhat, elitist, that if you can pay for your way out of congestion, it's one of the last democratic kind of inconveniences that we have. There is evidence, and there have been a number of studies that show that indeed the people that use them the most are contractors who have to get to a job site on time. And when they opened up the SR 91 hot lane, the majority of trucks at peak of vehicles at peak period were trucks. So not clear that it's clearly an exclusive arrangement. Express lanes more so. If you want to use it, fine. If you don't, it takes vehicles out of the mixed flow lane, so theoretically it makes congestion a little easier. There's a reason that's not the case, and we can talk about that if you want, but that's the public perception. According to pricing, I think has a long way to go in the States. It would be great to see attitudes think about this differently, but I think it's a heavy lift from the polling data and from the general regard. Michael Bloomberg really tried, and he basically was not in my term of office. Am I going to be able to do this?
What if we just put it around the whole state of Oregon?
Why not? That's VMT, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's quite a cordon, but yeah, you could geofence the state. Again, privacy concerns there too. England, it might have worked better because they were so used to the surveillance, extensive surveillance. Singapore, Dr. Lee was the benevolent dictator, and he could tell you to do anything. So again, not a challenge. I'm not sure why there wasn't more pushback in Sweden, but there wasn't. By the way, it didn't fly in Edinburgh. It didn't fly in Milan. There was another state, Rome, a couple other places where the public pushed back on cordon pricing and said, we don't want this. And the same challenge with VMT fees in that regard. Okay, last set of trade-offs, equity and fairness. We hear a lot about how tolling is going to be hard for low-income households, especially those that have to own cars to get around and travel. And so there have been a number of experiments and ideas floated on how to deal with that problem, some sort of income-based tolling arrangement, something similar to what we do with phone service and electrical rates, lifeline services. So there are workarounds. There's been some research out of UC Berkeley, Karen Frick, and some others who have done some ways to implement that system. On the other axis is the amount of the impacts on geography. We hear a lot about rural households and businesses being more burdened by tolling and losing from it than for. Again, fuel taxes, we argue that rural households have higher, longer trips, and they have less fuel-efficient vehicles, so they tend to perhaps be burdened more by fuel taxes at the moment. There is some evidence that that's offset by they take fewer trips. So, but on a per-trip basis, they're probably taking a higher burden. Same thing for VMT. If you're not taking as many trips, you're not distributing that cost over all the travel you do. I don't know. And then obviously, long-distance trucking, city to city, rural situation, you're paying a lot more in VMT than you are in an urban environment where delivery trips and trucking trips are shorter. Okay, with that said, let's look at these sources. Bridge tolls right in the middle, I think. It depends where the bridge is, basically, and who's paying for it, and whether the trip you take from the rural area into the city, if you're going to cross the bridge. Hot lanes, clearly an urban phenomenon. We don't see a lot of hot lanes outside of urban metropolitan areas. I'm trying to think if I know of any. I don't know of any. Although there is some interesting examples, the Chicago Skyway, which was tolled, I guess that was all tolled, so that wasn't a hot lane, but basically it charges people from Indiana to come into Chicago, so there is that. You might have a similar situation here. Express lanes, I think, again, that's pretty obvious. Cordon pricing clearly could be hard on rural households, especially now that we see housing becoming more affordable outside of the urban area. I think you have to be mindful of the effect that cordon pricing could have on land use. If you're inside the cordon, you don't pay, although that policy could be changed as well. There's a whole area of land use effects that I haven't gotten into here, but we can answer questions about if you want. And VMT fees, there is this perception in the rural area that this would be the hardest on them. They would see the most increase. Again, it's not clear that's the case. There's some research that has shown that indeed, because of the higher gas tax that the lower mileage fleet is using in the rural area, they might be better off with a VMT fee, or at least not as hard hit by it. And because they're taking fewer trips, although the trips are longer, it's not clear whether they would suffer more than the urban area. But it is a perception, and you do have to deal with perceptions. So, last topic. Okay, federal laws. How do you get such a project launched if you wanted to do it? The FAST Act, the federal authorization, provides basically two programs or two ways to do this. But first, we need to remark that the current the law basically forbids tolling on interstates. So you need an exemption, you need a program to get past that, but that's the default in the federal legislation. If you do get an exemption through Title 23, there are two programs. Mainstream tolling programs come in two flavors. Section 129 can be applied to new construction, basically, and some reconstruction, like on a bridge or a tunnel or something like that, or a restoration program for an interstate. And then the other, the 166 applies basically to hot lanes and HOV lanes and converting those. They do have some interesting prohibitions. One is that it has to be a new lane of capacity. So if you're building what is like an auxiliary lane, that would appear to run afoul of these restrictions. I'm not an attorney, but that's my understanding of that. So the pilot programs that are out there are the ones that probably have the most application to Oregon. And unfortunately, none of these have any federal money in them. They used to. VPPP had some, I think 9 or 12 programs around the country. Competitive programs when they had money, very competitive. They've been used to build HOV lanes. They've been used to develop some interesting programs. Oregon has one for Origo. So you already have that authorization basically in place. And then something that I think is particularly of interest here is the interstate system reconstruction and rehabilitation pilot program. Yeah. Anyway, that's probably, there are 3 slots available. One state, I forget which state, North Carolina? Missouri. It doesn't look like it's going to use its.
North Carolina, Missouri's still on.
Okay, yeah.
I think it stands, Missouri's still in over the next year. It's North Carolina and Virginia that opted out.
That opted out,
so
right, the two
3
that
slots
opted
are
out.
available.
So
Do we know their reasons for opting out?
I think that there's some requirements to get environmental clearance and do a bunch of things, and I think they just couldn't get themselves programmed. I believe also one of the restrictions is that you have to show that you don't have the funds through another source.
That's correct.
And so that could set up some interesting challenges here.
Madam Chair, there was some toggle about maybe it might be, at least I've heard from one state, it might have been easier to accomplish their goals by using the mainstream programs, the Section 129, because all 3 of these states jumped in immediately. When this pilot was made available, they jumped in early, and they've held this position for about 10 years.
Yeah.
It's just not until the FAST Act that said, hey, wait a minute, you got to fish or cut bait, folks.
So there was a shelf life to this. All right. Jerry's going to get into some of the Oregon applications, but any further, we can come back if you have questions.
I want you to think about this, because this is just cutting to the chase. And Chris, you're familiar with the Portland metropolitan area. So you've just described the universe of opportunity that exists. If you look at the I-5 corridor, and we're just having conversations, I'm going to give you the big 3 conversations we're having about the Rose Quarter, where I-5 and I-84 come together. I-205, we have a section that goes from 3 lanes to 2 lanes at a Stafford interchange to the Abernathy Bridge on Interstate 205. And then we have on 217 opportunities to open things up with, for all intents and purposes, auxiliary lanes. But those are the 3 major congestion projects that we have identified in our conversations, whether it's from a governor's vision panel, whether it's from this commission, whether it's from the leadership at the legislature that is debating a potential funding package. As Jerry walks through the policy issues, I'm going to give you a little time to think about it, but given the opportunities, the constraints, and those 3 sites, share your thoughts where we may be best positioned to move forward.
Sure.
Okay?
Yep.
And through which program we have the best success rate?
I mean, I can venture something now, but why don't we let Jerry get through and I'll come back.
Well, since I know you all are waiting for that exciting answer, I'm going to run through this very quickly because most of this information I think actually is in the cover memo. But I think really the bottom line is that, and I think in large part because of the work that was going on with the I-5 bridge, you have the authority to toll. There's no need for legislation. It's really, as long as we abide by the federal rules, you have everything that you need in order to move forward. I think the key is when you look at the statutes, so there you go, you can establish road. I think the important message is that you're still Article 9, right? So you still have those limitations as you think about the funding. And then just not wanting to step on toes, recognizing that cities and counties could do tolling. And I think this was important for Multnomah County in particular with some of their bridges. The statute really laid out, here's what we want you to cover in your rules. So the rules, one of the key messages in here is being thoughtful about what the local governments want within the area of the toll being considered. So making sure you're keeping there in mind. In fact, really a requirement that if a toll project needs to be in a local or regional transportation system plan, so if it's in an MPO area or City of Portland or whatever. Obviously, just some of the things that you heard Chris talk about, what's the impact to the environment, to the aesthetics, a lot of around the revenues, so understanding that, and you took this farther in your policies, but the toll revenue wasn't enough to build the facility, then what was the financial package look like? How would you make sure that those occurred? Ability to set toll rates. Looking at the amount of traffic, looking at the type of folks that would be using the facility, cost of construction, and it's sort of linked to system compatibility, whether you'd be using sort of the toll booths or going more electronic. And obviously, you heard Chris talk about all of the impacts of those types of decisions that you make, and they can come at a cost. The administrative costs to a tolling facility really needs to be taken into account when you set up the toll rates. Really just want to sort of step back. When the commission approved the Oregon Transportation Plan, we did have a recognition in there as you think about funding of the system that tolling might be an opportunity. Didn't do a whole lot of work in there. We got direction from the commission to delve deeper into that conversation and really working with Cambridge Systematics. We spent about 2 years developing 7 policy papers. They're all on the website. I think we provided the links in the paper that you have, but some of it, of course, was the timing. Is tolling an effective means of reducing GHG emissions? So these were the questions that the commission asked around the papers. Where geographically could tolling work and under what circumstances? Are truck-only toll lanes a viable option in Oregon? How do we incorporate tolling into our transportation models? So sort of the work that can be done there. What's the economics of transportation system reliability? How should the economics and social effects of these broad applications of congestion pricing be assessed? And how do you determine if tolling a project is a better alternative than a non-tolled option? So we went through all of those, and some of those papers are a little out of date, but we didn't find any. For instance, we didn't find any need for truck-only toll lanes in Oregon. Pretty limited applicability with regards to tolling geographically. But some of them obviously need to be updated relative to some of the new technologies and that information. But I think it was pretty good foundational information. It really led us to making some changes to the Oregon Transportation Plan as well as to the Oregon Highway Plan, because this really affected the highway system. So this was some action that the commission took back in 2012 where they amended the OTP. And the first one really gets at the management of the system, so it was linked to that goal. And then the second one was around the funding of the system. So that was a strategy that was put in place, excuse me. And then really we delved in deeper into the Oregon Highway Plan, and so you simultaneously made changes to the Oregon Highway Plan. You actually sort of really lifted this. There's background information, a couple of pages around tolling in the Oregon Highway Plan, as well as some policies and some strategies that you see outlined here. Probably similar to the work that we did even prior to that around bypasses. I think, some of the keys in the first policy, making it a requirement to have a formal finance plan if you do tolling, that really set some stages in policy 6.3 about how you would analyze the impact to the environment, how we would look at the public understanding and support for tolling. Those types of things are sort of linked to policy 6.3. In 6.2, which I didn't highlight in here, it does get at the question about, is it possible to toll existing capacity? And again, linked it back to what was in local plans. And then really a theme in all of this, and I think it was, again, because of the I-5 bridge, sort of that tolling technology and making sure that our system was strongly connected to Washington State. So making sure that interoperability really existed between the two states. And then just to sort of close by saying that I guess it was 2 weeks ago tomorrow, something like that. We spent our Friday up in Portland with Federal Highways. I think it was really sponsored by Federal Highways, representatives from Metro, City of Portland. I think Washington County was there, a couple other counties, obviously ODOT, really trying to get sort of that understanding of what was out there from a federal standpoint. Also, I think for Metro and others, what we had in place as a commission, as an agency, and then really the work that Metro and some of the local governments had done as well. Spent a little bit of time understanding, I think, two of those two pilot programs, so it was a good presentation by Federal Highways. I guess it was their consultant. And then we actually had two case studies, Los Angeles and Washington State. And a lot of it just talking about sort of all the steps that you need to take to go through that. I think it was Los Angeles that really spent a lot of time talking about the communication and the heavy lift it was to get that level of involvement. So that's really sort of, I think, where we are today. So part of the reasons for doing this, and then I'll turn it over to Chris to answer the director's question, is that obviously we're waiting on the legislature, understand exactly what the next steps might be. But I think most importantly, after you hear Chris's response, is there anything that we could be doing to be supporting you more? What more information do you want? What could we dive in a little bit deeper that you think you might need as we go forward, hopefully with a funding package? So that was just a quick rendition of what you as a commission have done. I think I'll turn it over to Chris. Hopefully you can answer the question now.
Commissioner O'Halloran.
I think my question's not as much on the what, but how you would actually execute or implement something anywhere in Oregon. And if you can't do it on interstates, what do? Charge them to get off the interstate? I'm trying to figure out how we would actually make it work in a practical standpoint. And having spent a lot of time in the Northeast where tolling is prevalent and you can't get on the New Jersey Turnpike, you can't drive from Washington, D.C. to Maine, you're on toll roads pretty much the whole way. So, it's really the execution of the idea that I think going forward that we need the answers. What would it look like if we said right now, yeah, let's go toll? How would we do it? So I'm very clear on the what and the different ways that we can do it. I've seen it work in other jurisdictions, and other countries aren't as much of a good example, but the closest tolling I know to us is probably the Bridge of the Gods. I mean, they have it's owned by the port and they go over, but I don't know, on the West Coast where tolling's done and how they do it. So I think for the next conversation, we ought to look more like if this commission were to say, or the even coming in the package, in the transportation package that we want to toll, how would we do it? And I think that's more my challenge with it, not the what, but the how you'd actually execute and implement.
It's a good question, and if I can respond to the director's question and maybe yours at the same time. The most obvious place that it's done and has been used to sort of adapt the public to the notion is on bridges. And the Bay Area is probably a good place to look because it's moved from tolls that were purely there to pay off the cost of building the bridge, which they did in the Golden Gate Bridge. And when they finished paying it off, frankly, the commission decided it kind of wanted to stick around and do something else more useful. So they kept the toll and they launched a whole bunch of transit service. Golden Gate Bridge District buses were deployed to take people off the bridge, which was very congested, put them in buses. They developed the ferry system. the tolls on the Bay Bridge and the other 5 bridges in the Bay Area have been increased steadily, and they added congestion pricing to the Bay Bridge, and they've used that money to deploy a lot more transit. They also used it to pay off that, I can say this because I'm from the ridiculous bridge, right? It was $6 billion. So clearly that's the how in the most benign way to do it. You have a pinch point, and as I think one of your counterparts in the California State Legislature, the Speaker, Parada, said, anytime you can ask 100% of the electorate to vote on a revenue measure that only affects 40% of them, you got a sure thing. So that's what they did. They raised the tolls, and they're raising them again. So that's the how. If you're going to toll a specific segment of roadway, and the director mentioned 3, typically what we look for are segments where you have as little opportunity for diversion as possible, because what we see as tolling, the upside is you can leverage private sector investment to help fund the cost, but they scrutinize the amount of traffic that comes over and the ability to drive that traffic onto parallel routes if the toll goes too high. So they're what are called traffic and revenue studies, TNR studies, investment grade, which really scrutinize that and look at it. And when I look at those 3 corridors, I try to think about what would the travel demand model, what would the analysis show me about the length of the trips? Are they long enough that people see a real savings, or a little opportunity to divert to a much slower and more circuitous route to get around the toll? And on major interstates where that's pretty much the only way through, that works well. When there's lots of opportunities to get on and off, that creates problems. If the majority of traffic is transiting through and is going to have to go through that segment and keep going out the other end, that's a great project, and that works. If they're a large, significant portion of the people going to a destination that pretty much ends where the toll ends, then diverting off just before getting out of it creates a challenge. Now, you can solve those challenges. You can put up gantries at all the exit and ingress points and make sure that anybody who's getting off to avoid the toll is going to pay it, whether they want to try to divert around the segment that's being improved. I think the third thing we look for is something that significantly improves the public perception of what they're getting for the toll. So if you're adding a lane, or you're reconstructing a bridge that's about to fall down, or you're building a new bridge, or you're adding an opportunity to opt in and pay a toll and use a carpool lane, those projects tend to have much higher acceptance. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but those are the conditions that I would look for. And so if there's a significant portion of the travel, and I don't want to get into the specifics because it's amazing when you do data-driven analysis of each corridor what you find in terms of its feasibility. And we've done a lot of toll feasibility studies where projects that looked good turned out not to be, and some projects, not as many, that didn't seem to work too well, could be made to work well. So the devil's in the details, but those are conditions I'd look at. I don't know, Director, did I get to your... I can go further and sort of... Yeah.
What I heard, bridges are your target of opportunity there.
They are. They're pitch points, and they create an obvious place where users see a benefit, and evasion's very hard to do that. And from a hassle and an administrative cost of collection, they're pretty easy to do. A segment of roadway, and I've just sort of eyeballed some of these corridors you're talking about on the I-5. My suspicion is that there are a lot of trips coming into the Rose Corridor that are ending pretty close to downtown or in downtown, and if that percentage is, north of 50% or 80%, that's setting up some pretty big challenges for a tolling type operation. At that point, I might look more seriously at a cordon pricing arrangement, which is tolling people coming into an urban center and capturing everybody, so there's no evasion there, diversion.
Well, I was hoping for a very specific answer to to Matt's question about the three.
I came as close as I could without the data. I'm sorry.
But
Yeah.
I do agree that the devil is in the details. And when we looked at this in 2009 and 2010, I think all of us on the commission at the time went into it with great expectations and hopes that we'd really find some ideal spots. We didn't look at those three particular ones, although to some degree we did. And when we got into the details in every case, it didn't make sense at that time. Now, higher traffic now, maybe it starts to, but it's a case by case analysis, and with a lot of guesswork and detailed kind of looking at all of the inputs and outputs.
Yeah. Again, I don't know how much sort of information you want on this, but one of the key elements of a tolling project is that if it's done with a form of congestion pricing, it tends to have an outcome that to the public anyway looks like a positive benefit, because one of the more compelling pieces of research out there shows that as you increase, if you're just building capacity and you're using tolls to pay for more capacity, it's very unlikely you will reduce congestion. That what we're saying is that the amount of travel, vehicle miles of travel, increases proportionally with the amount of capacity you add. So anytime you build more capacity, we provide more throughput, more people are getting through, but delay and congestion isn't going away. And tolling provides an opportunity to have an effect on that, to basically price people who don't really need to travel at that peak period of congestion out of the peak. And improve not only travel time, but one of the things we're finding, and we're doing a big project with the 101 corridor in San Francisco right now, all the way from the Bay Bridge to Silicon Valley, the most congested corridor in the state, and one of the highest value in terms of people's time, is that reliability is beginning to count now as much as travel time. I want to be able to predict how long my trip will take, and tolling provides you an opportunity to improve reliability. Which turns out to be, when it's unbundled from travel time, sometimes is important or more important.
I guess the only other comment I'd have is maybe contrary to that to some degree. It seems like something that is simple, not exact. I mean, that's what the fuel tax is really. And to me, then, the VMT tax user fee gets close to that and does allow for congestion pricing, but in a sort of broad, not real specific way. You know, to the extent we get more and more specific, we get more and more problems, and you get into you get into diversion, and you get into fairness. And if you just say, hey, you're using the roads and you're using it at these times, that starts to get fairly simple and get close to I won't say acceptability, but close to the rough equity that you're looking for.
Yeah.
You mentioned land use.
Yeah.
Would you mind just briefly over some of the top items there that we need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, and I'd be interested from any ideas from anyone else, because there's some controversy about this. I mean, there's a whole area of controversy around land use that has to do with growth inducement or suburban sprawl. You have an urban growth boundary, for example, and to the degree that you're beginning to build more capacity with tolls on a particular corridor, to what degree are you encouraging people to commute longer distances? So from a suburban to rural type corridor, you have to be mindful that you're creating opportunities. We see this in a number of places around the country where major toll roads have fostered more development, more suburban sprawl. It also creates some opportunities for value capture. A lot of the interchanges and other places along these toll roads have created tremendous improvements in property values, and so you can fund some of the facilities through value capture, and that's a land use phenomenon. The coordinate pricing side of things has been very interesting, and how it's really improved property values and overall sort of more comprehensive costs of living, to in these cities that have done it. And because not only are you reducing, you're not paying the toll if you live inside the cordon, they've significantly improved public transit. So living in an urban area now becomes much more desirable. Some of the money is being spent for in London, but I think actually in all three, and in Gothenburg too, which I think is the second city in Sweden, to improve bicycle facilities and networks, to improve pedestrian facilities, and the fatalities, the deaths have gone down significantly in these places where they've done it. So those are considerations that affect land use, again, the livability and the reasons to be location.
The only thing that I would add is going back to our limitation. I mean, a lot of tolling, you end up looking at other modes, right? Bicycle, pedestrian facilities, increasing transit. We'd have to work at that. What does that look like? How would we be able to do that here to sort of compensate, for lack of a better word, between those needs? The other, for as many of the land use sort of positives, there are the negatives potentially of seeing not just the suburban sprawl, but businesses moving outside of the toll area, and just sort of even changing the traffic patterns. So I think you sort of have case studies of each one. It's probably, again, part of that analysis you have to look at depending on what decision you make, and then what are the land uses that are actually there.
Yeah, Jerry, you bring up a good point, and we've stayed away from the whole topic of exemptions, which you can provide all sorts of exemptions to mitigate those impacts. In a sense, exempting people who live inside a cordon is an example, exempting HOVs is an example, but there are lots of exemptions. We heard a lot from the two case studies at the workshop about slippery slope there, so.
Speaking of exemptions, would you mind, I'm back at this slide.
Yeah.
Thoughts on opportunities for us? Do you have a recent example of an exemption that's been granted? And then also opportunities that you might see for us in terms of the pilot programs?
It's a little bit uncertain. I'm going to defer to the director because I think you guys have been looking at this pretty carefully on that. There's certainly been some recent successes in Minneapolis with the VPP program. They did HOV hot lanes, and frankly, that turned out very well from what I can tell. But again, that was when the program had money in it. So the money, frankly, was probably more important than the exemption. A lot more important. So in that regard, I think the 129 and 166 are not particularly relevant in your situation, but it's simply because some of the facilities you're looking at, not all, the auxiliary lanes on the I-5, for example, I think wouldn't fly. No, probably not. I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I think that would be a challenge. Whereas the other two programs would, pilot programs, the ISRPP and the VPP would apply, but you already have a VPP. I mean, I think you could proceed with that. But Director Garrett?
I think you're right. I think we've identified 3 or 4 exemptions that have played themselves out. They're somewhat surgical.
Yeah.
But there's something to take away. Now, is there direct application to some of the venues that we were looking at? Maybe, maybe not. Just more spade work to be done.
And I don't think there's going to be nearly the competition for these exemptions that there were when they had money in them. But I do think FHWA will look hard at the projects and decide, is this feasible? Is it going to produce a toll stream that works? And as I said, the ISRRPP program has the stipulation that you can't fund it with your existing sources, so something to consider.
Other comments or thoughts? Okay, certainly food for thought. You know, I will say that I think it's an important tool for us to have, and we're running out of options in terms of how we invest in our infrastructure. So I think it is responsible of us to be looking at ways in which we invest and the right ways in which we do that. So thank you very much. Jerry, your question to us, do we need more information? Is there something else that you want us to be looking into? Is there anything else that you need from us today?
No, I think thinking about your question, Commissioner O'Halloran, is maybe there's something, and I know we're looking at some of the case studies, and maybe we can spend a little bit of time of what it took to execute and what it took to implement, providing some of that information. I just think every place is going to be unique, but this isn't something that you flip the switch, decide to toll on Monday and you get it going on Tuesday. It's a long journey. And I think probably in the information we can provide you, we can give you a little bit of a sense of what that might look like.
I guess I just want to say it's good to be having this conversation, and I'm glad the legislature is showing real interest in this. We've got to get some of these new ideas on the table and figure out how to make them work. I just was on the East Coast using the Easy Pass to get through, I don't know how many states we went through. Worked great. I mean, once you get it implemented and you have a situation where you can make it work, then it really is not very burdensome. But
If I may, Commissioner O'Halloran asked the how. I think I asked the where question. I think you need to combine the both, and that will dictate a pathway here. I guess, Chris, the one thing I would ask is, given your experience and knowledge in this area, and then looking at what the state of Oregon has in terms of policies, just where we are, and again, we're probably at a front end of any, at the very front end of any conversation. What do we need to continue to advance or lean into to position us for these opportunities? Because I think Chair Boehne is exactly right. We're at a point right now that using the existing tools ain't cutting it. Yeah. And I think we're disadvantaging the citizens and the businesses in the state of Oregon as congestion continues to rise. So what do we need to do in terms of prep work, whether it's policy, protocol, or practice? Because we can prepare that. Then there are legislative conversations that may animate opportunities because they may bring funding, which helps. It'd be nice to see if the federal government opens up funding rather than just financing tools, but that's to be seen. But I want to make sure this agency and this commission are informed of, here are the pathways that you have taken. Here are opportunities that you continue to pursue that better positions you to take advantage of mainstream or pilot type projects.
Well, first off, take a bow, because Oregon is regarded as one of the more innovative places where tolling's been explored, and the Origo program is really well regarded in my industry as an example of a big step in testing the concept. Unfortunately, testing a concept with a limited number of volunteers doesn't get you to that threshold of stepping over it. So, Director Garrett, to your question, I mean, generally what we advise is finding a project that clearly screams out, not only is it feasible, but it's going to be perceived by the public as a necessary tolling example. So you pick a corridor that's congested, that's long enough, that doesn't have all the challenges of diversion and invasion, and the capacity enhancement or the program that you develop, the investment you make is perceived by the public, whether it's a new bridge, a wider set of lanes, that sort of opportunity, whether you step into the whole HOV hot lane area and provide that sort of facility and you toll that. I worry that the hot lane experiment is sort of, I wouldn't call it a dead end, but it only gets you so far. It's a huge step now to go from offering some of the opportunity to pay a toll and use a faster lane to going to tolling an entire facility. And I think it's a huge threshold. And I think in some of the behavioral economics that I work in, setting up that sort of optional approach creates an even bigger hurdle to go to a mandatory approach. So I'd be mindful picking a project where you don't create this perception of choice and then you say, and now we're going to evolve to no choice. So it's almost worth stepping right over that and into, we're going to toll this facility.
Well, and that actually affirms what the young woman from Los Angeles
Yeah.
said. Just pick your project and do it.
Yeah.
There will be benefit.
Yes.
Now it's easy for her to say, but
Yeah, but the project that they picked was a hot lane. So just to be clear, they haven't stepped over that line yet. Cordon pricing or tolling an entire roadway, that's brave, that's new. But I do think you can pick the right project where the diversion, the evasion, you don't get pushback from local communities. There have been a lot of pushback in tolling projects from communities that feel they're going to be burdened with the diverted traffic. And that creates a public relations nightmare. So.
Before I let you go,
Sure.
we have a leader in our state who's been at the tip of the spear, as the director would say, in terms of this conversation. So I'd like to call up Senator Boquist and see if maybe he has any questions or thoughts that, since we have Chris here, we might as well glean from him as much as we can. So Senator, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You guys have more technology than we do in the legislature, but I would just point out, it's an interesting observation. I do have, thank you, Madam Commissioner, and for the record, Brian Boquist. I'm the co-vice chair of the Joint Transportation Committee, which normally doesn't mean anything because I'm in the minority, except that I have to deliver votes. And it actually really begs to the question of why you're discussing it and why we're interested in it, and that is we're out of options. And I think, and so doing it, I think one of the most interesting questions that needs to be answered, and probably not today, but the consultant can do it, and it was actually raised by Commissioner O'Halloran, and that is the how. Would point out to you that despite knowing absolutely nothing about transportation, after 10 months, I'm at about a 400 level college course, and some of you are going to have to catch up. Just pointing that out to you. And here's the how question. What we have learned, and we did extensive reviews of the state of Washington, is how they implemented theirs, started in 2007 with a popularity of 6%. And now it is a successful program that generates, in addition to addressing congestion reliefs, $2 billion in revenue, as I think all of you know where you could spend that right now if you had that authority. And I think the how question is what needs to come, because as is pointed out, in order to do the investment grade that you need for bonding, you have to be well down the road before you spend your money to do that. And I think across the river, and we've been in discussions, for those of you who aren't aware, with the director and legislators, with WSDOT and so on and so forth. I think maybe Chris could kind of look a bit, what is the Washington experience and how can we use their how to do something in Oregon if we have to jumpstart it. And I'll just be blunt, we are on the edge of whether we have the votes to succeed or fail. And we're on the edge, even if we do it, in 2 out of 3 times they have not gathered the signatures and we have not failed, and in 1 in 3 we have failed, which means we will know at your probably January meeting whether we succeeded or failed, at which point Plan B is to my left. That's Plan B, because there isn't a plan after that. And so I guess my question, and maybe Chris, I think he's a consultant, knows the how question and what have they done in Washington, and maybe how can you help educate the commission on what has happened in Washington, because they are in the 21st century, and as all of you know, we are still back with the horse and buggy and trying to figure out how to put the quarters across the bridge of the gods.
Fair point. I mean, Washington, it does provide a lot of good examples, and I see potential for similar experiments there. I caution you that what they did, like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, very successful, but clearly a project designed to simply pay for the bridge, the tolls go away when it's finished. And I don't think that's the model you're looking at, but it could be.
And I would just put for the record, and Chris made a very good point, and we've never met, so I'm not beating his choir here, but this is two-pronged. This is, how do you pay for the widening and how do you reduce congestion long-term? The two of them must go hand in hand. It's not, and that's why we, the legislature, you've seen the proposal out there, and the chairwoman has, is we're saying we need to set it up for congestion pricing, and we need to set it up for the tolling ability simultaneously. Because I see no mechanism out there to build our way out of this. And again, I'm only at the 400 level college course here, at this for 10 months. But I think whatever we do is going to be in tandem. So don't just stick with tolling and paying. It's got to have the congestion reduction piece into it. Whether we succeed or fail, I do not know, but I do remind you that at some point, and I'm the one saying this, and I'm the Republican, by the way, that at some point we're going to have to figure out how to cross that bridge across the river again. And that's going to mean we're going to have to interface and be connected with the state of Washington to do that.
That's where I had a dissertation on the unhappiness of the diversion factor into communities. So please, Commissioner.
Senator, I just want to thank you for being here, but more importantly, thank you for your diligence and hard work. I know that this goes a ways back to when you were trekking around the state, getting a lot of input on what ought to be in a package, and I think really made a hell of a lot of progress since then and in the last 6 months. And I think the notion of a user fee-based system is one that we want to embrace, and that as vehicles become more efficient, it shouldn't mean that infrastructure is free. And we want to encourage efficiency, but at the same time, we have to make sure those benefiting from the system are contributing to its upkeep, maintenance, and expansion. But so anyway, I want to thank you for that. I think we want to capture commuters as well, and from other states, and who can basically not pay anything into ours and system. But I think a lot of progress, greatly appreciated. Let me know how we can help in this process, and to get the transportation package over the line. And I think it's hugely helpful that the approach you've taken is that nothing's off the table. We know there's not a silver bullet that's going to solve all the funding problems, but I think it's very encouraging that you guys are looking at pulling all the levers that get us to a very different place than we are at today. So greatly appreciated, and I think we are, I hope I speak for my other commissioners, but we are willing and able partners to help in that process. But the work's greatly appreciated, and I think it really means a lot prospectively to the state. So thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments or thoughts? Senator, any? Okay. All right, thank you very much. More to come. Okay, next item on the agenda is our consent agenda. We are pulling item 3 for a brief discussion on our right-of-way. And so I will welcome Scott up with us, and would welcome a motion if there are no other adjustments or amendments to the consent agenda. I'd go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, I would agree with that. So consent calendar items 1, 2, and then 4 through 11, without any conflicts, I would ask to be approved in block.
Okay.
And then we can move to item 3.
Okay. A motion?
I so move.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Mr. Motion. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Okay, okay, motion carries. So, item 3, Scott, I'll turn it over to you, right of way.
All right. Chair Boehne and Commissioners, Director Garrett, thank you for the opportunity to come and clarify a little bit more information about these wonderful letters that you get each and every month from me. You got a letter that I kind of put together in your package. I think that it would work well for me to kind of go through this background and then skip some of the detail and get to the meat of the point here about what happens to the process afterwards, if that's okay with you.
Excellent, yes, and go, sorry. Go ahead and pull your mic in so we can, yep, thank you very much. And
Not used to
go-
doing
oh,
one of these.
No, you're doing
All
just
right,
fine.
there we go.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the crowd's going wild behind you.
Yay. All right. So for the record, I guess my name is Scott Claus, and I'm the ODOT interim state right-of-way manager. I was asked to provide background information to all of you on the resolution for authority to acquire property letters put forth on the monthly consent calendar, including what the letter does. These letters are created by my right-of-way staff, who query a database called the Right-of-Way Information Tracking System to provide the reported information that you receive in the letter, and that is the STIP project name, the individual right-of-way project file numbers, property owners' names, and the county in which the property to be acquired is located. All of the STIP projects in the letters have a right-of-way acquisition phase cost associated with them. that has been approved as part of the currently adopted STIP list. They have been designed enough to define a project footprint on each piece of property within that project, which includes the property descriptions and sketch maps. At that point, the actual right-of-way process of appraisal, relocation, and acquisition from each of the owners listed in the letter is ready to begin. It is at this point that the resolution for authority to acquire property letter is sent to you from me to be given the authority to acquire by purchase, condemnation agreement, or donation the properties listed in the exhibit. Adoption of the resolution by you allows the right-of-way section to initiate those negotiations with the landowners and to subsequently file condemnation complaint on any of those properties for which negotiation acquisition is not possible. If there's a subsequent or subsequent revised description, it must be approved by the OTC also by resolution. So when you look at the exhibit and you look on the right side of there's boxes on the right side. If one of those is checked, it's been in front of you before already, and we've revised the footprint of what we need to acquire from that particular property. And so we ask you then to go ahead and reauthorize us to go and do that negotiation with the landowners. So in the discussion piece, it's kind of in depth there, but really what it boils down to is once you've approved the resolution, we hire state, certified appraisers to go out and then determine what the compensation should be for a piece of property. It gets appraised. Then we do that in-house and outsource it. Complicated ones are typically outsourced. Easier ones would be done by people in the regions, in the regional offices. Once that's done, that sets the just compensation that we're going to be our negotiation piece with landowners. So that's the piece that how we set that, what that bar is. And then within limits, we can do administrative settlements. So we start to negotiate with the landowner, and I've listed, I think on the back there's certain 6 items there that are parameters that we think about as we go through negotiations with landowners to determine maybe there's something we didn't know even at this point. And so in the negotiation, we give landowners opportunities to come forward, give us additional information. Maybe they have an appraiser that has appraised their property, and they can share that information with us. And so that's kind of in a nutshell the process we would go through to set just compensation, then to go ahead and negotiate with them. If the value is a little bit higher than what we had appraised it at, we call that an administrative settlement. There are limits to that within the regional offices, the 5 regional offices. If they go above their limitation that I give them, then they have to come back to the state office. And then we work with condemnation. And of course, when it goes to condemnation as a last resort always, the jury decides how much it's worth, that piece of property. And they make a judgment in court and we pay the bill. So are there any questions I can answer about kind of this process, what this letter kind of sets us on course to do?
Do we have questions? I quite frankly have not. The way you laid that out was really beneficial. Thank you.
Okay, good.
And most important to me is that condemnation is the very last thing that we want to see happen. So, but it does sound like it's a very well-oiled process that we go through to make sure that we're doing all that we can to work with the property owners and et cetera. So,
Thank you, Chair Bainey. Yes, it's a very rigorous process
Mm-hmm.
and it's very litigious.
yes.
Everybody has lawyers now that
Yes.
troll our projects, and so we have to be very careful about how we do it, or we'll lose every time. If you don't dot your I's and cross your T's almost to perfection, you lose the case and you end up paying a lot of fees.
It's also a public relations piece for the agency, I think, in how we handle that. So it sounds like our approach and the tone in which we take is how I would like to see it as well. So
Great.
thank you.
Okay.
Do we have other thoughts or questions? Please. Commissioner. Oh, or Director. You guys duke it out.
I guess, no, commissioners win. In the revision, when the box is checked, how does the commission know what the revision is? Is it a $5 conversation that went up to $6 or potentially down to $4? Because it can go both ways, correct?
That's correct, Director Garrett. what happens typically in that process is the footprint has changed for some design reason late in the process. So we've gone out, we've contacted the landowner, we've started the negotiation process, we may have even appraised the property. We hope we haven't gone that far because that's an expense that's you have to revise the appraisals, but that does happen occasionally. And so once that's been identified, new descriptions are written, a new design has been done. Before we can make those offers, we have to have your authority to do that in a revised footprint. So you wouldn't necessarily know if it has grown or if it has gone down. We track revisions as a performance measure because that's costly to do them later and later in the process, and it also delays projects. So we call it the design acceptance phase in our project delivery process that we get to. We say pins down to the designers, the engineers. Doesn't always happen, but that's the rule that we try to live by to keep those costs to a minimum. We have descriptions and sketch maps for each one of these projects. We don't present them with this, but they are available to the commission should anyone want to see them. And we could supply them at any point. If you said, hey, it'd be a great idea to have those with revisions or something. I mean, I don't want to come in with a big stack like this, but for revisions or something, it'd be very easy for us to supply them if that would be beneficial to folks.
Possibly just a notation of what you're calling out would be beneficial to know. I think what we wouldn't want to be is surprised if there were a significant increase. We'd want to probably celebrate if there were a decrease.
I think that's right, Madam Chair. I was struck by a comment that Commissioner O'Halloran made. Well, how do you know how you're trending over a period of time? And my guess is you track those things, right? You can share. This is kind of where we are in terms of the revisions on the plus or the minus side. It just seems to me that might be a piece of information that is a little more descriptive than a check of a box. But I defer to the commission if that's a piece of information they'd like.
Mr. Brown?
I appreciate the information. My biggest concern was with the resolution, am I signing a blank check up front? So this gives a little more background, and I think understanding where we are, if there is litigation against some real property owners, and there aren't always, but there are a fair number of them. I would like to know that, and we say, yep, go ahead, get the property, but sometimes it's not that easy, or we wouldn't need you and your larger staff. So I think knowing what it takes to get real property and what some of the issues are, and did we do due diligence do we really have to have that piece, or could we have moved something? I think those are things that you and the engineers need to be aware of. That's what I want to look at. We identify something and we're so headstrong that that's got to be the only thing, and we don't look past it could have been over here and done just as well. So those are the other things I think with acquisition of real property, especially condemnation, that I want to make sure that we look at.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Brown, maybe I can clarify some of the process in the design process. We have an environmental process. We look at all kinds of different alternatives for a project before it ever gets to right-of-way acquisition. So,
I understand that.
yeah, okay.
But I just want to make sure we keep doing that.
Yes,
So
yes,
thank you.
and we do have a tool for construction that we use quite often. It's called a state's obligation. Our construction offices don't necessarily like us to use them too often. But if a person says, hey, we could, if you make sure my driveway is open on Thursdays from 7 to 4 while this is being done, I'll sign your deed. We say, let's go check with the construction office and see if that kind of thing can be done. And we call it a state's obligation, and we'll put it as part of the negotiation to get them to sign the deal. So we do have some tools like that we use.
Great. Well, I would welcome a motion if we don't have further questions. So the motion would be approval to adopt the resolution, or even item 3 on the consent agenda is just as.
Madam Chair, I move approval of item 3 on the consent agenda.
Okay, very good. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Excellent, motion carries. Thank you very much. Great job.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we ran over today, but we had important discussions that I feel like we needed a bit more time on. So I want to thank you for staying longer and apologize that we ran over, but really appreciate everyone's involvement and the commitment of the commission. So we are adjourned.